Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Mysteries of Magic in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, A Play of Light. Now feast your eyes upon the glory of my spell work. Holding the teapot in one hand, Constance elegantly raised her other hand in front of her, conjuring up a magic circle to focus her powers into the correct spell. A combination of well-chosen words left her lips in a whisper, and from the tips of her fingers, a barely discernible ray of light shot out and hit the surface of the tea as she poured it into one of the delicate porcelain cups. Before their eyes, the color of the tea changed from a dull brown into all the colors of the rainbow, gently rippling through the liquid in sync with the movement of her fingers. The Imperial Princess and head of the Academy's Black Eagle's house hummed appreciatively, not quite the reaction Constance might have sought after, but the gasps of awe from the other students around the table at least lifted her spirits somewhat. Incredible! How did you do that? The colors change even as the tea is being poured. It's spellbinding. Constance laughed. Well, of course it is spellbinding. I did it with a spell. One of my own, in fact. I dare say I exceeded even my own expectations. Whatever do you mean, Constance? Edelgard asked calmly, though Constance could discern a hint of amusement in her voice. Did you not expect your spell to work? Constance blinked, lowering the teapot even as her right hand continued to manipulate the surface of the tea in the cup from a distance. That is, she cleared her throat. Of course I did. I was merely being humble. She watched Edelgard and her retainer, Hubert, exchange a look and felt her cheeks warm. The man standing by the princess' side always kept such a dark and brooding expression, and even though Constance had tried to make herself ignore it, she couldn't help but feel a tad undignified by his apparent lack of trust in her skills. Did Edelgard think the same as her retainer clearly did? She wanted to defend herself, but she knew it would be ill-befitting in the present company. Well, Edelgard sighed, it is true that I have never seen anything quite like this before. Constance perked up. Perhaps she had been hasty in her judgment. The Imperial Princess had never been anything but fair to her, after all. However, Edelgard continued. I do not mean to be disrespectful, Constance, but I fail to see the use of this particular spell. Ahaha. I suppose it may be difficult for you to properly understand its potential. She caught a dark look from the princess retainer, quickly adjusting what she had been about to say. At this point in time. However, I assure you, a Novelli spell is never without use. Edelgard smiled, inclining her head in what Constance could only interpret as assent. Her delicate hand reached for the cup, then hesitated. Is it drinkable? Constance couldn't help scoffing. Of course it is drinkable. It is merely a play of light, Lady Edelgard, Hubert said matter-of-factly in his usual noble lilt. An illusion, one might say. It does not affect the taste or composition of the tea itself. Oh, how she wished she could have proved him wrong. She sent a silent prayer to the goddess, then lowered her right hand and interrupted the spell, hoping that the tea would retain its new coloring. As soon as her hand fell to her side, however, the rainbow dissipated, returning the liquid to its ordinary hue. The students that had gathered around the table whispered to each other, then left when they realized there was nothing more to see. Ah, Edelgard said. I see. Well, you still went to all this trouble to prepare tea for me. Let's have a taste, shall we? Constance smiled and bowed, then seated herself opposite the princess and smoothed out any wrinkles in her skirt. I am certain it shall be to your liking. I chose one of your favorite brews. Edelgard raised the cup to her lips and drank as Constance did the same with her own cup. The princess swallowed with a smile, nodding in appreciation. The Hresvelg blend, she asked, her voice taking on a happy cadence. You really are attentive. But of course. I strive for perfection and elegance in all things. The mere thought of inviting you for tea without careful preparation is abhorrent, and would be a disgrace not only to me and my family name, but to the concept of tea time itself. Let's not blow this out of proportions. Edelgard set the cup down and tilted her head to the side, as if studying her. Now, did you invite me here for any particular reason? Constance took a too large sip of tea, yelping when she burned the roof of her mouth. Ah. That. Well, it has to do with what we spoke about last moon, if you recall. About seeking my assistance in restoring your noble house to what it once was? Yes, I recall. I also seem to recall telling you that my current circumstances impede me from accomplishing any such feats. I am merely the imperial princess, I do not currently have such power. I'm aware, Constance hurried to say. But surely you see the advantage of having such an extraordinary spellcaster by your side from as early on as possible. Hubert cleared his throat, causing Edelgard to hide a smile behind her hand and Constance to blush. I didn't mean to imply. It's quite all right, Constance. There is no doubt that you are a remarkably skilled mage, even Hubert can see that. Constance glanced at the retainer, who smiled grimly. She sincerely doubted that was true. Just a week ago, that very retainer had confronted her late at night outside the library, demanding that she stopped wasting Lady Edelgard's time with worthless spell demonstrations. Constance, flabbergasted and annoyed to no end, had argued fiercely. Her magic was far from worthless, in fact it was infinitely useful, and if the lady wanted to be rid of her, she could very well say so herself. Since she had then stridden away and slipped into abyss before he could utter another word, she did not know whether he had found her arguments sound or not. Not that it mattered. She could not care less for the opinions of a petulant servant. However, Edelgard continued, I cannot imagine rainbow tea to be of much more use than as a mildly entertaining party trick. Oh, Constance exclaimed, following it up with a gleeful laugh. That was merely a sample of my repertoire, you know. I am constantly seeking to develop and learn new magic, just imagine how far ahead of your adversaries you will leap with each new discovery I make. Edelgard took another sip of the tea, humming thoughtfully. That may be so. I shall keep your request in mind, but as things stand, there is not much I can do at present. Constance laughed contentedly. That is all I can ask. Filled with new determination to prove her usefulness, Constance made her way to the monastery's library in search of new magic books to peruse, making sure to return last month's treasures before heading for her favorite shelves. The library rarely received new works, but she had not yet made her way through the entirety of the magic collection. She tried not to think of the day she would run out of texts to study, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. Fortunately, there were so many books left that she had a difficult time choosing which ones to read next. She murmured the titles to herself, running her index finger along the spines of the books. Now, what subject to study first? The last book she read had covered the basics of faith, hence the recent experiment with light magic. She had focused on black magic for most of her life, so faith had brought with it a fresh breeze of new perspectives. While she was eager to continue down that path, she nonetheless longed to go back to familiar territory. Black magic was where she excelled the most, after all, it was where she had the most potential for breakthroughs. Perhaps to dabble in some wind magic? Or perhaps, she thought as her finger came to a stop on a book named The Compendium of Light and Dark, perhaps she ought to go back to the basics and make sure that she had covered it all, and hadn't forgotten anything vital. She pulled the book out of its place and carefully flipped it open. A man's laugh rang out nearby. She glanced to her left to see two students from the Blue Lion House, Sylvain Gautier and Annette Dominic, sitting by a table some ways off. Annette was a sweet girl, competent in magic as well as in singing, but Sylvain's reputation as a hopeless and relentless flirt had made Constance steer clear of him. Even now, he was most likely trying to sweet-talk the poor girl. As if he'd heard her thoughts, he turned his head and met Constance's gaze. Still smiling, he sent a wink in her direction. She gasped quietly, turning back to her book with indignation. That was no way to behave as a noble. He should be ashamed to abuse his gracious title so. She could feel his gaze burn into her side for another moment before he finally returned his attention to Annette. Constance relaxed her shoulders, trying to distract herself from her anger by perusing the contents of the book. It was separated into 3 parts, one introduction to magic in general, followed by one part that covered faith magic, and lastly, a third part on reason magic. The third part apparently included a chapter on dark magic, which was interesting. She had never studied dark magic, since texts on the subject were few and far between, and it was generally frowned upon to delve into it. As she let her gaze slide across the chapter names for the 5th part of the book, she quickly realized that it was noticeably more sparse than the others. She browsed to the first page of the chapter on dark magic. In reason, dark magic is without question the more insidious of the two types of magic, as implied by its common name. Only a rare few know how to wield dark magic, and the most prominent examples of such spellcasters have come from cultures with little or no faith in the goddess Suthis. As such, dark magic represents a magic wielded first and foremost by heathens. Those on the record for learning the dark arts have been noted to go through mysterious changes in both personality and appearance, losing sight of their own soul and being driven to evil as a result of the unknown forces at work in dark magic. While there has been the occasional exception to the rule, these exceptions have never been fully explored, due to their rarity. Readers are cautioned to avoid dark magic except under exceptional circumstances and with supervision from an experienced caster or other expert in the arts. She swallowed, browsing back to the table of contents again. Yes, she had heard of the risks with dark magic. She knew that some of the students at Garreg Mach could wield it. Her good friend Happy was one of them, but as far as she knew, those were cases where the dark magic had manifested itself naturally. It wasn't outright forbidden to cast dark spells, but the subject was only taught and sparingly to those who had already reached a certain degree of skill. None of the professors knew any dark spells, as far as she knew. Well, there was no need to dabble in the dark arts, and she suspected the book didn't teach much on the subject either. That was all right, though, she still had a long way to go in the other fields of magic. This book seemed interesting, and while she had heard of the title before, she had never read it. It was worth a gander. She closed the book, then took a couple of others that seemed interesting as well. She eyed the table where Sylvain and Annette sat. Sylvain was still going strong with his flirts. With a sigh, Constance made her way past them to a free table closer to the furthermost bookcases. Laurence stood by them, speaking to one of his classmates in the Golden Deer house. When Constance approached, he smiled and inclined his head to her. "Miss Novelli," he said. Holding her pile of books under one arm, she brought the other to her chest and bowed fully. "Lord Gloucester. A pleasure to see you today." "Oh, I assure you, it is my pleasure," he said, his smile growing more assured. His gaze slid down to the books she now dropped onto the table. "The Compendium of Light and Dark, A classic." Yes, this was quite the find. "I imagine it is highly sought after, since this is the first time I have seen it in the monastery library. Have you read it?" "Ah, no, not yet, I'm afraid." He made an elegant hand wave. "Lysathea likes to quote it verbatim, however." "Is it not a required read at the Royal School of Sorcery, then?" "It is not, unfortunately, although I have heard about its merits from several of my peers since." "I do not think I shall be disappointed." "Well then, I shall leave you to it," he said with another small bow. "I wish you a pleasant afternoon, Constance." "You as well, Laurence." She smiled and inclined her head as he turned around to face his classmate again. Not wanting to eavesdrop, she turned to the table and sat down, opening up the Compendium of Light and Dark. Laurence Gloucester might only be an alliance noble, but he certainly knew how to carry himself. She had not yet had the opportunity to speak with him at length since they were in different houses and therefore classes, but from what she had gathered, he had the right ideas about the duties of the nobility. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that those ideas somewhat affected the way he interacted with her, however. While she'd once been a noblewoman, Laurence might see her as nothing more than a mere commoner now. She shook her shoulders in an attempt to rid herself of the cold anxiety creeping up her spine. No matter. She would return to nobility in no time, and when she did, he would know to respect her as a peer. She turned the page to the first part of the compendium, the introduction, and began to read. The murmur around her faded the more engrossed she became in its contents. She read quickly, recognizing most of it from her previous studies, but slowed down as she came to an interesting passage a couple of pages in. In the olden days, staves used to be the only way for humans to channel magic. This can likely be attributed to the fact that magic was once a highly revered and therefore largely unexplored field. When one Faudlain's researcher by the name of Nicholas finally gathered the courage to research the subject in earnest, however, the possibility of channeling magic through advanced formulae became a widely accepted theory. This eventually led to our modern-day use of magic, where staves usually merely fill the role of magic vessels with which to strengthen or focus spells. The formulae allow the natural energy around the caster to be drawn in and immediately discharged without the need for staves to act as vessels. The drawback of this is that the intricacy and complexity of the formulae will drain the caster of their energy more quickly than staves, which can store more energy more efficiently. Thus a lesser number of spells may be cast within one single battle by a mage using formulae. This amount usually increases as the caster further hones their skill. Even without formulae, small effects can be created by those who natively possess great magical abilities. Without a formula or staff to properly channel the magic, however, the caster will be drained of energy nearly instantaneously. Formulae can be used for all kinds of magic, although the workings behind the formulae differ between reason and faith. In the black and dark arts, the caster uses formulae to construct the fine strands of primal magic around them. Here, the formula can be described as a direct command which will fail or succeed only depending on the caster's own skill and innate abilities. As regards light and white magic, while the caster still has to summon these raw strands by themselves, it is the goddess who shapes those threads into the spell. The formula is a manifestation of the prayers of the caster, and its success depends not only on skill level, but also on their level of faith in and connection to the goddess. Faith magic, as its name suggests, therefore builds upon asking for and being offered help by the divine powers. For this reason, faith magic is sometimes viewed as a less complex art than reason magic, which requires great precision and skill on the caster's part. Faith magic possesses its own complexities, however. Constance paused, sitting back to think for a moment. Naturally, this was not the first she had heard of the history of staves versus formulas. The basics of channeling were taught to the very beginners. However, the distinction between faith and reason was new to her. No one had ever explained to her that formulas had such different applications in the two fields. While she had only just begun to learn light magic, she had already noticed the distinct difference in power and accuracy levels in comparison with black magic. Light magic rarely if ever seemed to miss its mark. If a spell worked, it landed. However, it seemingly did not allow for the same might as black magic did. Ideas and thoughts flourished in her mind as she kept reading, leading her to go and fetch a quill and some ink so that she could take notes. Before dipping the quill, she cast a basic spell on the ink to make whatever she wrote with it easily removable. This was a classic book on magic, she couldn't possibly ruin it with her scribbles, however beautiful her handwriting was. She would transfer the notes to her own notebooks later. She dipped the quill into the ink, then leaned in to underline the sentence about faith magic being less complex than black magic before adding a quick note in the margin next to the paragraph. The might of a light spell may also depend on the caster's level of faith. Could the might be improved by use of more concise prayers as well? It made sense to her, at least, that the goddess would be able to more faithfully recreate the caster's wishes and prayers the clearer said prayers were. Up until now, Constance had only replicated the faith formulas created by others. Perhaps if she tweaked them slightly, her results could improve? A loud yawn from the other table brought her out of her thoughts. Sylvain had just wrapped an arm around Annette, who was still deeply engrossed in her books. "Hey, what do you say we go get some sweets together? Just the two of us." Before Annette could answer, Constance stood up so quickly that her chair fell over. Sylvain turned to her with raised eyebrows, watching as she righted the chair, closed the book and grabbed all of her things before stomping over to their table. "Excuse me for interrupting you so brusquely, but your attempts at charming this clearly uninterested woman are so painful to behold that I simply cannot stand idly by any longer. Can you not see that she is attempting to use her valuable time to submerge herself in her studies, and that you are making it unreasonably more difficult for her?" Sylvain stared at her. His arm slowly unfurled itself from Annette's shoulders. Constance scoffed. "Oh, how eloquent. Truly befitting of a noble and a descendant of the 10 elites, no less. You should be ashamed of your behavior. To be so fortunate as to be the heir to a prominent house, yet possess no respect for your peers whatsoever. Shame on you." I was just..." "Annette," she said, speaking over the poor excuse for a man. Annette's head jerked up. "Shall I accompany you outside?" The girl looked incredibly uncomfortable, and no wonder, with such a disrespectful creature still hanging at her side. "That's all right," she said quietly, stroking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she glanced down at her book. "I'm fine, really." I can handle Sylvain. But thank you, Constance. Constance nodded tightly. As you wish. She gave the obnoxious man a glare, at which he quickly held up his hands in defeat. Hey, sorry, he said, though a smile tugged at his lips. Guess I can't help it, huh? Do not bother making excuses with me, she said indignantly. We both know that it is not a question of capabilities. She turned and left before he could say anything else. Better to study in her underground haven, Abyss, where it was calm and silent and usually free from bull-headed men. By the time Happy showed up in their quarters in Abyss, Constance had schemed through the rest of the introduction and skipped the first parts in favor of Chapter 14, on lightning magic. She had continued to scribble little notes in the margins as she went, potential uses for spells here, possible combinations of them there, or just whatever idea popped up in her head while reading. Even the things that weren't completely new to her sometimes drew out new theories, and she was experienced enough in studying by now to know that no thought was worth forgetting. She had notebook after notebook full of her previous scribbles. Which reminded her, she should probably transfer the notes to one of them before the end of the day. She was just so engrossed right now. Hey Coco, her friend announced as she entered. What ya reading? Constance barely looked up from the page, where she was just scribbling down a remark about how, in contrast to what the author stated, two vastly different variables might be possible to combine in one spell if she tightened the formula slightly. The compendium of light and dark, she said automatically, glancing at the previous page so she could view the author's formula again. Perhaps she could even exchange the change sign for the one representing strength. Might that lead to a spell with both higher accuracy and might? Sounds great. Even while distracted, Constance could hear the sarcasm in Happy's voice. She looked up with a frown. You sound as though you beg to differ. Happy stood on her tiptoes and stretched her arms up toward the ceiling, opening her mouth in a big yawn. Oh ajush no it fow it's incorrect. Will you please wait until you have finished yawning? I cannot for the life of me understand what you are trying to convey. Her friend smiled, but finished her yawn before landing on her heels again. I'm sure it's a great book. I just think some parts of it are a little prejudiced. But you're smart enough not to fall for that. She moved to her bed and lay down on her side, resting her head on her arms as she blinked tiredly at Constance over by the desk. Prejudiced? Care to elaborate? Happy yawned again, although this time, she didn't attempt to speak until the yawn had passed. I haven't read it myself. I've just heard rumors. It's probably fine. Has it given you any ideas for cool new spells yet? Constance forced down the questions she wanted to ask, noting the way Happy had quickly changed the subject. Even if they were only rumors, it wouldn't do to take false information at face value. She would have to keep it in mind as she continued reading. But for now, she pushed it aside and allowed herself a triumphant smile. Certainly I do. Believe me, my dear friend, this next spell shall be marvelous. The author discusses a formula for a lightning spell with which to create a small light source that can be maintained for up to a minute. I am confident, however, that with a few tweaks to the formula, I shall be able to prolong the effect as well as heighten its strength. Happy blinked slowly. Why not use a fire spell instead? As a torch? Ahaha. A cunning question indeed, one which the author does not neglect to ask in the text itself. Had the creation of a light source been my only aim, then yes, a simple fire spell would certainly suffice. However, my intentions are not to create light, but life. Her smile widened as she saw Happy frown in confusion. Life, but how? Constance couldn't stop a gleeful giggle from slipping out between her lips. She leaned in toward the bed. Do you recall the half-dead rodent that we found last week? Happy nodded. Sure. You used a spell to put it out of its misery. Indeed I did, a lightning spell, in fact. And do you remember what happened to the rat? It died. Constance laughed again. Oh, Happy. I mean afterward. She brought out her fan, slowly waving it in her face in practiced movements as she waited for Happy to finish pondering the question. Yeah, its legs jerked, right? Like it was trying to run away. Exactly. Even in death, its muscles held a final burst of energy, which it expelled through movement. I have pondered on that interesting display ever since. Imagine if I had used a fire spell, or ice. Would the rodent have moved? I guess not. All magic is an expulsion of energy, for all magic requires energy in order to be cast. That is why we can only cast a limited number of spells within a brief period of time. We need to rest and recharge between battles. However, none of the other types of magic create energy in the way that lightning does. Fire consumes energy, ice preserves it, wind stirs it. But lightning creates energy. That, dear Happy, is why the rat's legs moved. My lightning spell created energy where there ought to be none. Huh. I've never thought about it that way. But what does that have to do with creating life? Life and energy aren't the same thing. I should clarify my previous statement. I did not mean life in natural beings, but rather raw mechanical life. Just imagine. If a lightning spell can create movement in the muscles of a deceased animal, it can certainly be used to bring the same kind of life to objects. The author's spell is much too weak, it would fizzle out too quickly to matter. If I can improve the formula. Not to be the rain on your parade, Coco, but lightning magic and formulas have existed for thousands of years. If there was a way to make dead objects move, wouldn't someone have figured that out by now? Constance snapped her fan closed and pointed it at Happy. Ahaha. Formulas may have existed for thousands of years, but I, Constance von Novelli, have only been alive for a mere 18. Happy smiled softly, her eyelids clearly growing heavier and heavier for each passing minute. That's my Coco. Chapter 2, Smoke and Mirrors. Why, if it isn't my favorite spellcrafter. Slept well, milady. At the sound of the velvety soft voice, Constance spun to face the door, scowling at the figure leaning against its frame even as she felt her cheeks warm. Yuri. These are the women's quarters. The unofficial leader of Abyss made a show of peeking inside, letting his gaze move between the empty bunk beds. He could barely keep his amused smile contained, and she did not care for it. Then where are the women? Ugh, she exclaimed, reaching behind her own back to grab her bag from the desk before starting toward the useless fool in front of her. Kindly bring your so-called humor someplace else. I shall not miss my class. She stopped in front of him and glared up at him in an attempt to get him to leave. He smiled down at her, black-lined eyes gleaming beneath his bangs as she pointedly eyed the shoulder he rested against the door frame, effectively blocking her path. Forgot something. Step out of the way, you. Now, none of that, he cooed, straightening enough that her forehead became leveled with his throat. I don't want you to forget anything important for your class, and that book there looks awfully lonely on your desk. He lifted his gaze above her head. Constance turned her neck to follow his gaze. The compendium of light and dark lay by itself near where she had been packing her things. Letting out a disgruntled huff, she turned and stomped back to tuck it in her bag. Yuri followed, mumbling its title to himself like an incantation as she picked it up. Light and dark, Are you experimenting with new kinds of magic? She scoffed. What kind of a question is that? If I am to restore my house and return the name of von Novelli and our mastery of magic to everyone's lips, then naturally I shall have to constantly strive to better myself and my craft. He sang, extending his left arm past her side to carefully brush his fingertips against the front of the book. Even going so far as to study the dark arts. I suppose I'm going to have to make a habit out of calling you Shady Lady, huh? She swallowed down her annoyance at hearing the pet name he'd given her as of late, trying to instead focus on the contents of his comment. I never said a thing about dark magic. While it is not out of the question that I might one day explore that path, I intend to first deepen my current knowledge in faith and black magic. Ah, he said as his hand reached the book's spine, lightly brushing against her fingers. And here I thought that black licorice magic was your greatest achievement. I suppose you have yet to explore the spicy magics. She jerked the book to her and tucked it into her bag. Ha ha, she said as she stepped away to create some space between them. Hysterical. Perhaps if you dedicated your time in Garreg Mach, one of the most prestigious academies in all of Fodlan, mind you, to studying some of the finer arts instead of loitering down here all day long, you wouldn't feel the need to resort to such crass ridicule. I would ask you to join me in class, but then I am certain I would quickly grow to regret it. Yuri made a mock bow. Thank you for the gracious invitation, milady, but I must respectfully decline. He winked. I'm a lone wolf, after all. With that, he turned and left the room with his usual precise, silent stride. Constance sighed and closed her bag as she started toward the doorway. A lone wolf, indeed. After class, Constance packed up her things painstakingly slowly, registering out of the corner of her eye how the other students steadily trickled out of the room. Except for Linhard, who was sleeping in his seat with his hair flowing out over his books, and Ferdinand, who had immediately walked up to the professor after class to supposedly ask him questions about its contents as usual, the classroom eventually became empty enough that Constance dared to make her way toward the exit. She stopped beneath the roofing right outside the classroom, looking this way and that to make certain that no one was currently watching her. No one seemed to have their eyes on her at the moment, however. Perhaps if she pretended to read while walking, she would not stick out as a sore thumb as she feared. Relieved that she had thought of it, she opened her bag and reached inside. She was just about to bring out one of her books, when she realized that something was off. Pulling the bag in front of her, she peered down into it to make certain that she had not simply imagined it. There were only 2 books in there. And neither of them was the compendium. She glanced back over her shoulder, but no book lay where she had been seated. Surely she had brought it with her this morning? A picture of a smirking face enveloped by long, lavender-colored hair appeared in her mind's eye. Constance clenched her jaw. Even Yuri wouldn't stoop so low as to steal a book from her, would he? Oh, that rascal. Before she could think twice, she stomped out into the harsh sunlight, making her way toward the secret entrance that would take her to Abyss. She would find that scoundrel, and she would confront him, and then she would. Her steps sagged somewhat as a feeling of dread began creeping up on her. What if it wasn't Yuri? What if it was her own fault? What if she had lost the book somewhere, and someone had stolen it? Or even worse, what if it had been ruined by nature? What if she had dropped it in a puddle of water? While the sun was out now, it had rained all night, and she had noticed such puddles on her way to class. What if it was the monastery's only copy? And of such a vital, fundamental book. Ah, and she had not even remembered to transfer her notes last night. All of her work, lost. Well. Knowing her, it was likely wasted time at any rate. Oh, she was such a useless, hopeless creature. To think that she had even dared to borrow such a crucially important piece of literature from the library. Her. Clearly she didn't know better. She had a knack for ruining things, after all. And why anyone would ever trust her with any book from the monastery library? It was beyond her. Her puny intellect could not even begin to fathom how someone could make such a mistake, although surely no one else could be blamed but her. She would be expelled from the academy, as she deserved. Left to struggle in the mud, where she belonged. How could she ever have thought that anything good would become of her? Coco. Hey, let's get in the shade. I'm sweating pigs here. A steady arm tugged her to her right, and a moment later, the sharp light from the sun faded into the background as roofing once again shielded her from its ruthlessness. Constance blinked, taking in the face of Happy in front of her. She looked concerned, but there really was no reason for that, was there? Happy, she exclaimed, glad to see her friend out and about. Have you finally decided to join a house and begin your studies as well? Were you heading for the Black Eagle's classroom? I believe the professor might have already left, unless Ferdinand is still keeping him prisoner. No, nothing like that, Happy said, shaking her head. I was just taking a walk. But it's way too hot and I chose the absolute worst time to go out. Look at all the people around here. Constance did as she said. There were indeed quite a lot of students in the area. It is lunch break, is it not? Speaking of, shall we go together? Happy cringed. Nah, I think I'll just return to Abyss, actually. Abyss, Constance murmured, recalling what she had been intending to do just a moment ago and feeling her anger return. Indeed. Have you seen Yuri in the past half hour or so? I think he left a little while before me, actually. Why? Constance huffed indignantly. I believe he stole something from me. Happy looked skeptical. Yuri Bird? You really think he'd steal from one of us? That is simply the only explanation I can think of. I must find him. That book is invaluable. Well, if it's true that he took it, don't you think he'd know to take care of it? Maybe he even found it somewhere. Could you have dropped it? No, Constance said, shaking her head firmly. I would never. Yuri was the last person except me to see the book. Okay, Happy said slowly. I'm just having a hard time seeing him steal something from you. Unless it's important for some secret reason, she paused. Yeah, okay, I could see him do that. Constance sighed deeply. He always believes himself to hold the one and only truth. When I find him. She looked around. If Yuri wasn't in Abyss, where could she most likely find him? Perhaps he had gone for lunch. Her gaze paused by the entrance to the dining hall. No lavender-colored hair in sight, though he could already be inside. I shall see you later, Happy. See ya, Happy said quietly, and if she added something else after that, it was drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd around them. Yuri was not in the dining hall, neither was he in the entrance hall, by the fishing pond, in the greenhouse or on the training grounds. She briefly considered searching for him in the cathedral, but no, she knew that she would not find him there. While Yuri had studied faith magic, she knew that he had little actual faith in either the goddess or the Church of Syros. She had been tempted to give up several times along the way, mostly, she had to confess, due to the abhorrent sunlight bathing her in anxiety, but the book was simply too important to allow herself to lose hope. In the end, she returned downtrodden to Abyss, hoping to find the trickster there. He did not return until after dinner, however. At that point, her anger had mostly drained away. She found him in the Wilting Rose Inn, drinking away with other Abyssians, but she kept her calm when walking up to him, even as he faced her with his usual self-assured smile. Shady lady. You look beat. Can I buy you a drink? You shall do nothing of the sort, she said with a sigh, feeling a small measure of content as his smile faded slightly. Something amiss? He asked, a wrinkle of concern appearing between his brows. You could say that, she exclaimed, crossing her arms over her chest and ignoring the eye rolls from Yuri's drinking buddies. Did you steal my book this morning? He blinked at her. Your book? Oh, don't play coy, Yuri. The book. The Compendium of Light and Dark. Surely you don't mean to suggest that you already forgot. Understanding dawned in his eyes, and the wrinkle smoothed out. He picked up his glass of wine and took a slow sip without breaking eye contact with her. Constance felt her patience begin to trickle out, but she would not let him have this one. She waited while he drank, staying silent even as he set the glass down again. I didn't steal your book. Thief's honor. Have you checked the library? Maybe you lost it somewhere, and someone returned it. As soon as he said it, she felt incredibly stupid. Returned it, to the library. How had she not come to think of that on her own? She pursed her lips. Of course I did. His smile returned. Oh, you did, And was it there? No, she replied curtly. But I shall look again. She spun on her heel, trying to ignore the musical laughter ringing out behind her as she left. The sun had set behind the rooftops of Garreg Mach when Constance made her way to the library, but students still mingled about, talking and laughing as though they had no care in the world. Constance had one care, however. She needed to find the book. The library was nearly empty aside from Linhard, although he was practically part of the furniture at this point. He leaned so far in over a book that she was unable to judge whether he was reading or sleeping. Knowing him, it was likely the latter. Constance walked straight up to the section on magic, taking a moment to search for the title of the book. And there it was. Feeling her heart slow in relief, she took out the book from its shelf and carefully flipped it open. While she absent-mindedly browsed through the first couple of pages, she considered how she might have lost the book and who might have found it. She could not remember having even put down her bag on the way to class, and she had definitely had it in there when she left Abyss, hadn't she? Come to think of it, hadn't she brought out some of the books during class? Had the compendium been one of them? Then where had it disappeared to after that? Her mind came to a halt at the same time as her fingers did. She stared at the page she had opened the book to. It was the introduction in Part I, and while she had expected to see her own handwriting next to the printed text she really needed to transfer the notes post-haste, there was something else there that caught her completely off guard. Someone else had made a note in the margins. A firm, steady script below her cursive one. And this note was clearly in response to hers. The might of a light spell may also depend on the caster's level of faith. Could the might be improved by use of more concise prayers as well? What would disprove the faith level theory? Constance stared at this note for a long moment, attempting to wrap her head around the question. The faith level theory, the theory about the success, and possibly also the might, of a faith spell depending on the caster's faith and connection to the goddess. What would disprove it? And more importantly, why was the other note-taker asking her this question? There could be no doubt that it was addressed to her, seeing as it had been written right beneath her own comment. Had whoever it was left any more notes for her? She browsed further into the book, and lo and behold, several of her notes had now been joined by replies from the unknown other reader. There were comments adding to her own spell ideas, either refuting them or giving her new insight into how a spell might be crafted, as well as more questions that were seemingly rhetorical. The other reader seemed especially intrigued by her notes on lightning magic, seeing as this was the one section where they had left the longest replies. With the below formula, it is possible for a black mage to create a small source of light, a feat ordinarily reserved for faith casters. The disadvantage of the black version of this spell is that the light source will flicker unsteadily, and that it cannot be maintained for longer than a minute before the magic collapses. As with all spells, a higher skill level equals a higher might and longer duration. However, as of yet, no mage has been recorded as able to maintain this particular spell for more than a minute at a time. This formula may not be enough, but what about another? CP. XXXV, ACC to the author, vastly different variables cannot be combined. Is this true? Could the celestial entity for strength make a difference? Attempt this spell on machinery. Consider my curiosity piqued. What do you hope to achieve by attacking machinery with an insignificant ball of unstable light? Regardless, formulas are mere tools, and so they are not rigid. You can view them more as, let's say, guidelines for the uninitiated. A simple recipe for the following kind. Why do you think the author argues against combining opposite variables? What does he gain from it? If you want the answer, look to the Elder Arts. Constance paused with the next page between her thumb and forefinger, reading the last note again and again. This one short note held so many new ideas and questions, she didn't quite know where to begin. Her thoughts stuck to the term she didn't recognize. The Elder Arts. If that was an established denomination, it was not one Constance had been familiarized with. It sounded like it could possibly be referring to older versions of formulas, although she couldn't remember having read about anything of the sort. And then the question about what the author would gain from stating that opposite variables cannot be combined. The real question was, what did this other reader stand to gain from asking her all these things? Why would a stranger contact her in such a way? She looked up from the book. Linhard was firmly asleep now, and the only other person in the library that she could see was Tomasz, the old librarian. He stood hunched over by a bookshelf some ways off. Closing the book and holding it against her chest, she walked with soft but determined steps up toward the man. "Excuse me." He jumped slightly, turning his head more quickly than she would have expected him to be capable of. When he saw her, his posture relaxed again. He turned to her fully, and as he did, he closed a book of his own. With the way in which he was holding it, however, she couldn't make out the title. "Yes," he asked, offering a benevolent smile as he rested his free hand on top of his cane. "Can I help you, young lady?" She smiled back. "Possibly, yes. I read a passage which mentioned something called the Elder Arts. May you know what that term could be in reference to?" For a moment, he simply smiled at her. His gaze crept down to the book against her chest. "The Elder Arts, you say? Which book is that you have there?" She was surprised to find that she felt reluctant to show him the title. What if he took it and saw that there were notes in the margins? "Ah, this," she laughed in order to buy herself some time. This was not it. I read it in another book, although I cannot quite recall its title. If you wish, I can attempt to find it again. Tamash shook his head. No, that won't be necessary. I was simply surprised to hear those words. I know most books here in this library, and as far as I know, none of them mention the Elder Arts. Perhaps I've missed one. He glanced at her book again, causing her to squeeze it subconsciously. To mask her sudden unease, she widened her smile into a grin. Perhaps so. Sadly, I do not have any books in particular to recommend on the subject. You see, Elder Magic is another term for dark magic, which, as I'm sure you know, is sparsely taught here at the Academy. Our library has been carefully curated by the Church to make sure that no one comes to harm. Dark magic, she breathed, smile having faded the instant he mentioned the art. Why the alternative name? Dark magic was discovered thousands of years ago by an ancient people sometimes referred to as the Elders. This is not something widely known, however. Are you certain you read it in one of my books? Ahaha, she laughed nervously. I must simply have misread it. How very peculiar that something akin to that name turned out to exist after all. Indeed, he said softly, tilting his head slightly as he watched her. Well. Thank you for your assistance, she hurried to add, already turning to leave. Miss Novelli, is it? She stopped, pausing to give him an uncertain look. Ah, yes. Excuse my manners. Constance von Novelli, pleased to make your acquaintance. A fair warning, be mindful of whom you mention the Elders and their arts to. With that, Tamash turned back to the shelves, effectively ending their conversation. Constance didn't waste even a second. She spun on her heel, then half ran out of the library, accidentally bumping into Linhard's table so that his head flew up in a sleepy daze. She mumbled a quick apology but didn't stop to hear his reply. If anyone said so much as hello to her on her way back, she didn't register it. Her brain led her automatically to the hidden path down into abyss, and only when she stood by the end of the final ladder with both feet planted firmly on the floor did it allow her to regain control. She looked to her right, which presented her the Shadow Library. A library she rarely visited, knowing full well that many of the books there had been banned from the monastery's own library. She could never bring a book from the Shadow Library above the surface, and she could never reveal the secrets those books held to anyone from the church. Up until now, she hadn't seen the appeal of scouring a banned section when there were still books in the monastery's library that she had yet to read. But now. Look to the Elder Arts. She lowered the compendium from her chest to stare down at its title. Who was this other reader? What did they hope to achieve by advising her to learn about dark magic? She had better tread carefully, take anything that the other reader said with a grain of salt. Dark magic brought with it risks she had never been taught how to mitigate. Still, that didn't necessarily mean she should ignore the stranger's advice completely. She was a von Novelli after all. It wouldn't do to turn away from an opportunity to develop her magical prowess. Once again embracing the compendium to her chest, Constance took a deep breath and stepped into the Shadow Library. This library was much more cramped and untidied than the one in the monastery, but she had long ago learned to look past the dirty corners and messes of the abyss. It was part of the charm of her underground haven, much like Happy, Balthus, and even Yuri were. To think that the library would be the part of abyss she was the least familiar with. It was shameful how lost she felt here. Fortunately, the other visitors didn't seem to pay her any mind, as it usually was down here. People took care of their own business and expected others to do the same. Except for Yuri, she thought with a sigh as she began to peruse the shelves. Yuri, the unofficial abyss leader who feigned nonchalance, yet worked harder than anyone to make certain that his catacombs remained a safe space for the outcasts of the surface world. If he could show that side of himself more, perhaps she wouldn't have to constantly feel annoyed at the sight of his face. Attempting to find something when she didn't quite know what she was looking for turned out to be more complicated than she had expected. Some naive part of her had perhaps believed that simply walking into the Shadow Library would give her the knowledge she needed. The truth was, however, that merely knowing the words Elder Arts was unlikely to yield results at this point in time. Even if she found a book on dark magic, she wouldn't know what to look for more specifically. Backing away from the shelf with disappointment rising in her chest, She flipped open the compendium and read the note from the stranger again. Why do you think the author argues against combining opposite variables? What does he gain from it? If you want the answer, look to the elder arts. Come to think of it, there seemed to be a pattern to the notes left by the other reader. Cryptic questions intended to make her doubt what she had been taught at the academy. She needed only look to his note in regards to faith magic. What would disprove the faith level theory? She carefully seated herself on a pile of books in one corner, reading the faith note again and again. The faith level theory stated that someone with higher faith in or a closer connection to the goddess would produce more successful and perhaps even stronger white and light spells. Naturally, then, the theory would be disproven if someone with low faith successfully cast faith magic, or if someone with a close connection to the goddess had a weakness in such magic. Had she heard of anyone like that? She ran through a mental list of all the magic users she knew of at the academy. There were the ones with a high faith level, such as Mercedes and Marianne, and those with an incredibly strong connection to the goddess, such as the Archbishop herself, who were highly proficient in the magic. Then there were the faith magic users who were less avid believers, yet still faithful to the church. She supposed she could count Linhard, and perhaps herself, to that group. Neither of them had any trouble with faith magic, although she may have to acknowledge that she was not yet among the very best. But then who did have trouble? Well, she knew there were some who had an outright weakness in faith magic. Foreigners, mostly, which would explain their low faith level and thus be in line with the theory. None of them disproved it yet. So what did the other reader mean by their question? Was there someone at the academy, or perhaps in its history books, who could disprove the theory? She gazed up at the nearest bookshelf. The shadow library didn't have it Amash, but perhaps Yuri could. Her thought hitched together with her next breath. Yuri. Yuri was a skilled user of faith magic. Yuri was, perhaps apart from happy, more resentful toward the church and its actions than any other person she could think of. Yet he was incredibly skilled at the goddess' own game. In her excitement, Constance nearly pushed over a nearby stack of books, making it wobble so dangerously that it was a miracle it didn't collapse. She couldn't remember a time when she had been in more of a rush to see the obnoxious man. Yuri could disprove the faith level theory. She ran straight for the inn, assuming he would still be there, but there was no lavender hair in sight. Letting out an exasperated sigh, she turned and headed for the men's quarters instead. She hadn't kept track of time. He might have already gone to bed, but if so, this was certainly a good enough reason to wake him up. While walking briskly past bumbling rogues laughing with their companions and night merchants just opening up their stalls along Borough Street, she mentally rehearsed what she would say to the male guards posted outside his quarters. Let me in at once. I need to see Yuri, my very future is at stake. Perhaps she should say, our very future, instead? After all, what was a tiny white lie in comparison to the importance of her errand? Yuri would be proud of her. So preoccupied was she with these mental images, that she ran straight into a man just turning a corner. She yelped in alarm, intending to spin to the side so as to avoid completely crashing into the other person, but steady hands gripped her arms and caught her full weight against their owner's chest. He stumbled slightly before catching his balance, but apart from that, the force of the impact was effectively nullified by his grip. She looked up and met two cat-like eyes lined perfectly with black. Yuri, she exclaimed breathily. Just whom I wanted to see. He let out an incredulous sound, blinking at her in apparent surprise. Did you manage to curse yourself or something? Had this been a mere hour ago, she might have scoffed at him. As it was, she was too excited to care. Tell me, she commanded. You resent the church, yes. He glanced around, still holding her arms in a tight grip. Cursed by the Archbishop then, is it? What an honor. Yuri. This is serious. Answer me. Or you'll turn me into licorice. Tell you what, if it's a taste you want. Goddess, she wished she could have zapped him with a lightning spell right then. Instead, she settled for stepping on his foot, earning herself a surprised yelp. Fine, fine, he said, finally releasing her arms. I wouldn't say I resent the church so much as disagree with their ways. But you are faithless, yes. He smirked secretly, causing a glimmer of mischief to spark to life in his eyes. I have my own faith. A faith unconnected to the Church of Ceros, yes? Yet you're a skilled faith caster. How do you go about casting a spell, Yuri? Yuri sighed, closing his eyes for a moment as he ran a hand through his hair. Ah, so that's where the knife plunges. Can we do this tomorrow? Truth be told, I've had one too many glasses of wine. It cannot, she urged quietly, knowing that it would catch his attention. Sure enough, he paused and leaned in, waiting for her to continue. Someone is challenging me. I need to get ahead. Surely you must know what that is like. Her fingers squeezed the book automatically, and judging by the way in which Yuri's gaze lowered and darkened in understanding, he must have noticed. Challenging you, he repeated, voice now devoid of all humor. Someone giving you trouble? Well. Yes, they were, in a way. But she doubted that was the kind of trouble Yuri was referring to. Nothing which I cannot handle, she said confidently. Yuri raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. No? Can I have my beauty sleep then? Ugh. No, you cannot. Not until you have enlightened me on your spell-casting methods. He smiled and shook his head. His right hand casually came up to rest against the wall, allowing him to shift his weight as he leaned into it. The other hand went to his hip, fingers grazing the hilt of his trusted sword. I know better than to say no to the shady lady herself, he began, smirking contentedly when she scoffed and rolled her eyes at the pet name. I'm not as well read as you are, so I apologize if this comes out as rudimentary. But when casting a spell, I gather my magical energy and channel it through a formula that reflects what I'm trying to achieve, then top it off with silent prayers in my mind. Is that what you wanted to hear? She considered his answer for a moment. Nothing in his description seemed strange, but how could that be? If faithless Yuri could cast faith magic just the same as any believer, what did that say about the magic itself? Hello? Yuri sang after she had been silent for a long moment. You still there? Constance blinked at him. Of course I am. I was merely pondering your answer. How do you cast faith magic yourself? About the same as you, I wager, she said with a sigh. Which confounds me. The faith level theory states that the closer the caster is to the goddess, and the stronger their faith, the more successful their faith magic will be. He tilted his head to the side, as he always did when considering a puzzle of any sort. He said. Well. Either your beloved books are lying to you, or I am just that good of a trickster. She scoffed. You mean to say that you are fooling the goddess herself? Yuri shrugged, an amused smile playing on his lips. It's all just smoke and mirrors in the end, isn't it? He pushed off from the wall and took a few leisurely steps past her. She turned to follow him with her gaze. Smoke and mirrors, she asked. Whatever do you mean? The church has a habit of trying to bury truths they don't want to accept, that's why the Shadow Library exists in the first place. He stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. It makes you think, doesn't it? If I can trick the goddess just by going through the motions, either she's not as all-knowing as the church makes her out to be, or she isn't watching at all. Constance watched in shock as he turned forward again and left her to ponder the ramifications of what he had just said. Or she isn't watching at all. Did Yuri understand what he was suggesting? Surely he must. Surely he must understand that he had just proposed that the church was lying about the existence of the goddess. How could he just say that with a straight face and walk off as though he hadn't just committed grave blasphemy? Yuri was highly skeptical of the Church of Ceros, she shouldn't take his words at face value. But if he was correct, it would invalidate not only the faith-level theory, but also the faith syntax itself. Were the prayers even needed to cast a faith spell, or were they simply a facade? Smoke and mirrors, as Yuri had put it? No, she told herself as she turned and started toward her quarters, book clenched tightly in her hands. No, she needed more information before she could pass judgment. Besides, if the faith-level theory was invalid, then how come all of the most avid believers excelled in faith magic? And why did all of the foreigners at the academy struggle with it? There must still be some truth to the theory. Was this simply an exception to the rule, then? If so, what did the mysterious stranger in the margins of the compendium gain from drawing her attention to it? She must dig deeper into this, and she knew just where to turn the first sod. Chapter 3, Rethinking Syntaxis. Despite working on less than 4 hours of sleep, Constance was near ecstatic. It was in no way an easy ecstasy. Her thoughts were disordered and hectic, her sense of time severely distorted, and she couldn't for the life of her focus on the professor's lecture. All she could think about was the book. The book that she had returned as soon as the library had opened in the morning, hoping that the other reader would be as eager as her to continue their conversation. Hoping that they would find the time to reply to her notes before the end of the day, so that she could get back to researching in the evening. After her conversation with Yuri last night, she had headed straight for her quarters, where she had spent hours reading various passages of the book and replying to the notes left by the stranger in the margins. She believed that she now had a better idea of what they had intended with their comment about turning to the elder arts for answers. It was clear that this other reader was skeptical of the church in a similar way to Yuri, and while she hadn't yet had the time to find books on dark magic in the Shadow Library, she was fairly certain that the other reader wanted to sow a seed of doubt in her concerning what she had been taught about faith magic. For a moment, she had been hit by the possibility that Yuri might be the other reader. It hadn't taken her many minutes, however, to brush that theory off. He may be a trickster and an excellent liar, but his reactions last night had seemed sincere. Besides, she couldn't see what Yuri would stand to gain from communicating with her through a book and on magic, at that. He'd never been much for that kind of research, and if he wanted to talk to her, he would do it directly. Constance, however, lived for this kind of research. It was in her blood. And thus it was that she spent the entirety of her day ecstatically thinking about the book, the other reader, their notes, and what secrets she might uncover if she kept writing to them. There were more people in the library this evening. Some students she didn't recognize at all, some were from the Golden Deer, however, and then of course, there was Linhard. He sat, or rather, slumped in his usual place, browsing through a book on top of a pile in front of him. Constance came to a halt as she saw the book. Was that a note in the margin of the page he was currently reading? Before she could think, she took a step closer, causing Linhard to register her presence and look up. His gaze was as bored and weary as ever, although she knew better than to doubt his earnest curiosity at this point. Someone who spent half of their time sleeping and the other half devouring books couldn't possibly be anything but driven to learn and uncover new truths. While this must be true, however, Constance had never really talked much to Linhard. They may share their interest in research, but the way they went about it differed enormously. She never quite knew how to talk to him. This time, however, he was the one who initiated conversation. "Constance," he said, followed by a yawn which he, to her pleasant surprise, hid behind a hand. "You've been here quite frequently lately. Found a new subject to research?" "Yes," she said distractedly, trying to gauge whether he was reading the compendium or not, but it was difficult to judge from this distance without being obvious about it. "I suppose I have. And you? What is it that you are reading today?" Linhard peered down at the book. "Crestology 11, he replied in a monotone voice. "Oh." She exhaled. "You shouldn't defile a precious book in such a way, you know." The words were out before she could think. She searched her mind for a way to smooth it over, but Linhard just shrugged. "This is Professor Hanneman's personal copy which he lent to me. He's had it for years and years, and it's filled with all kinds of scribbles." Constance felt her cheeks warm. "I see. How fortunate you are to have such a generous mentor." "I guess," he said with another yawn. "Bye now." "Goodbye," she said indignantly, forcing herself to ignore his rude nature. At least he hadn't stolen her book. She found it in the same place as usual. Her heart fluttered as she pulled it from its shelf. Would the other reader have had time to leave any new notes for her? Flipping open to the first page where she knew she had left a reply, she felt a surge of excitement as she saw that there were indeed new scribbles in the margins. What would disprove the faith level theory? There are non-believers who can successfully cast faith magic, but no rules are without exceptions. Why would I wish to disprove it in the first place? As a lesson not to take things for granted. CP. CCXL. She had already begun to head for the exit while reading, and was about to turn to page CCXL, when she walked into someone. She dropped the book to the floor, stumbling back in surprise. "Ah! Do watch where you..." Her reprimand was cut short when she raised her gaze and came eye to eye with Lady Edelgard's personal retainer. Positioned next to the doorway with his hands behind his back, he gazed down at her with the narrow gaze that had always reminded her of a lizard. There was just something about the angles of his face and the narrowness of his eyes that made him look nefarious regardless of what expression he wore. The fact that his right eye was completely hidden by black hair only emphasized the look. While he regarded everyone around him with that same gaze, perhaps except for Edelgard, Constance had never before had it so absolutely and strongly focused on her. It caught her off guard, completely eradicating whatever she had been about to say from her mind. She said intelligently, hoping that the rest of the words would flow out on their own, but there was no such luck. "I believe you were the one who walked into me," Hubert pointed out, his lilting tone ever so polite, although it carried the same sinister undertone as everything else about him. Constance could understand very well why he had been chosen as the Imperial Princess' right hand. "Well," she said indignantly, "because she couldn't come up with anything better." "I suppose I did." Hubert glanced down at the book on the floor, which reminded her to crouch down and pick it up. Thankfully, it had closed as it landed. She didn't want to think about what could have happened if he had seen all of the notes in the margins. "Must be an intriguing read," he said above her. Her fingers stilling just above the book, Constance's gaze fixated on his boots as her mind processed what he had just said. An intriguing read. What was he suggesting? Had he seen the notes after all? Before she could spiral further into her theories, he continued, "You looked quite engrossed." At that clarification, she gripped the book and stood hastily. "If you so clearly saw me heading straight toward you, you could have stepped to the side." If she hadn't known better, she would have sworn one corner of his mouth was tugged up into a smirk for a fraction of a second. "Better that you walk into me than trip and fall down the staircase further on. You should pay more attention to your surroundings." "Thank you for the advice," she said, fuming. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have somewhere I need to be. Please give my regards to Lady Edelgard." "You can give them to her yourself," he said, inclining his head to a bookshelf further along the wall. Constance followed his gaze and noticed for the first time since arriving in the library that Edelgard stood in the corner, currently browsing a book from the historical section. Hearing her name being spoken, she had lifted her gaze, and now her eyes met with Constance's. "Constance," she said with a smile as she nimbly closed the book and returned it to the shelf. "How is your research faring?" Constance looked from the princess to her retainer, who now quite clearly had an amused smirk on his lips, before returning her attention to the former again. "Lady Edelgard. Please excuse my rudeness," she exclaimed with a deep bow. "I was so engrossed in that very research, I failed to register your presence." "Oh, there's no need to worry," she assured her, closing the distance between them with graceful steps befitting someone with her title. "I was doing a bit of research myself, I know how it can be." Constance straightened from her bow again. At this point, both her face and her neck must be bright red. "Regardless, I must apologize. I should have been more attentive." "You should," Hubert added to her right. "If not for your own sake, then for that of others. Be glad that you walked into me and not Lady Edelgard." Constance couldn't be certain whether he meant it as a threat or not, but nevertheless, she had to suppress a shiver. "I apologize for that as well," she said, offering him a quick glance. "Apology accepted." Edelgard laughed, a beautiful, musical laughter that managed to relax Constance's tense muscles somewhat. "Oh, Hubert. There's no need to be so stern. After all, Constance's research is for the good of the Empire." She smiled at Constance. "I admire your tenacity. I wish certain others could take inspiration from you." At this, she glanced meaningfully toward Linhard, who seemed completely oblivious to their conversation. "Ah, yes." Constance was aware that Linhard refused to focus his concentration on anything but that which excited him, and that Lady Edelgard had tried in vain to talk to him about his bad habit to fall asleep during class. Constance felt a small confidence boost at being so highly regarded by Lady Edelgard, head of her class and future empress. She couldn't stop a grin from taking over her face. Ahaha! You flatter me, Lady Edelgard. I am honored to be in your house, and I shall never cease to strive for excellence in your name. Edelgard gave her a warm smile. Thank you, Constance. Rest assured that I have not forgotten your request. Constance beamed. I am ever so grateful. Well, I believe I must be on my way, Edelgard continued. Take care, Constance. You as well. I wish you a good night. Good night. The princess looked toward Hubert. He bowed, then waited as Edelgard moved past him and walked out the door. Before going after her, he gave Constance one last look. Good luck with your research. May it prove enlightening. Thank you, she said cautiously. He nodded, then left the room with precise, determined strides. Constance took a moment to calm her thoughts as well as her breathing. That went well, all things considered, but who knew what Hubert would say about her to Lady Edelgard after the accident with the book? She should have just apologized to him straight away, regardless of how she felt about it. But that something about his gaze. It was both unnerving and revealing, as though he had put her under a truth spell. She remembered the book still clasped against her chest, a place it seemed to inhabit almost automatically these days, and ordered her feet to move. She had more important things to do than ponder on the piercing gaze of the princess retainer. Consider my curiosity piqued. What do you hope to achieve by attacking machinery with an insignificant ball of unstable light? Regardless, formulas are mere tools, and so they are not rigid. You can view them more as, let's say, guidelines for the uninitiated. A simple recipe for the following kind. Why do you think the author argues against combining opposite variables? What does he gain from it? If you want the answer, look to the elder arts. Why are you asking me these questions? I understand that you are skeptical, but what do you stand to gain from attempting to spark doubt in me as well? As regards my intention with casting the lightning spell on machinery, I choose to withhold that information until I know who you are and what your own aims are. You asked whether it is true that vastly different variables cannot be combined. I answered your question. If the faith level theory is false, it shows that formulas and as a result, the faith syntax are not as rigid as the author claims. Have you attempted to manipulate the syntax yet? As for my comment on the elder arts, if you want me to spell that out, we need a more secure line of communication. My aim is to aid you in your magical research. If you need a name, you can call me Crow. Crow. Constance let the name roll silently on her tongue as she looked up from the book sprawled open on the dining hall table. She had already had her suspicions that the other reader was male, based on their handwriting and phrasings, and this particular choice of nom de plume only strengthened that thesis in her eyes. Didn't Crow sound distinctly male, after all? Or was that simply her own prejudice clouding her judgment? Either way, it would surely be easier to assume that she was correct for the time being. She could always adjust her theory at a later date if necessary. With that issue sorted, she quickly moved on to the next. To her great discomfort, the comment about her magical research indicated that he knew who she was. He must have seen her with the book, and he was apparently close enough to her that he knew about her research. Then again, she hadn't exactly been secretive about that part. Most people in the academy, especially in her year, likely knew that she was researching magic. And he wanted to aid her in that research, but why? He had clarified his aim, but it was still veiled in darkness. She doubted that he had purely innocent reasons for wanting to aid her. She would have to keep that in mind. Still, he had already managed to lead her in new directions. He had already helped her plenty. Perhaps there was nothing wrong in allowing him to continue. Yet if she wanted more information, it seemed she would have to find a safer way to communicate with him. Apparently whatever he wanted to say was not something he wanted the church to get a hold of. That implied that he held forbidden knowledge or wanted to encourage some kind of blasphemy. That very fact in itself was strangely titillating. Although perhaps it wasn't strange at all. The darkest secrets were usually also the juiciest, and if Constance wanted to achieve her aims of becoming one of the most innovative and skilled mages in Fodlan, of restoring House Novelli to its former glory, she would have to dip her toes in the dark pond. There was something intriguing about that whole ordeal, about exploring the darkest corners of magic. Whatever this crow could teach her would likely be rare knowledge that she might have difficulties with finding elsewhere. What did she have to lose? Now she just had to find a secure way to communicate. Her first thought was to find a new hiding place for the book, one that only the two of them knew about, but that could easily backfire. Someone could happen upon the book, and depending on what notes it contained at that point, it might spell bad news for both Constance and Crow. The only safe way she could see was to hide the notes themselves in plain view. Certainly there had to be a spell, or she could invent one, which could make ink invisible and then visible again at their will. The question was, which types of magic did Crow know? And what level of difficulty could he be expected to manage? Lady Constance von Novelli, a warm, smooth voice called from the end of the long table. If you were words on a page, you'd be fine print. Even before looking up, she felt annoyance bloom within her. Sylvain Gautier slid into the opposite chair, lazily running a hand through his bright red hair as he smiled the same smile she had seen him aim at hundreds of other women, and he wasn't even in the same house as her. She couldn't even fathom how fed up Annette and the other girls in the Blue Lions must be with him at this point. "Pray spare me your lines," she said dryly, "and leave me in peace." Sorry, he said, even as he leaned his elbows against the table, getting comfortable in his chair. "That was dumb. Honestly, I came here to apologize for that time in the library. I can be real dense sometimes, huh?" She scoffed. "Is this another attempt at swaying me to your side?" His forehead wrinkled in concern. "No. I swear. I've been thinking of what you said, and," he paused. It's not important. I just wanted to apologize. I don't expect you to be swayed or anything, I just don't want bad blood between us." She glared at him, hoping that he would give up and leave her be, but when he just kept looking back at her with pleading eyes, she eventually sighed and rolled her eyes. "Apology accepted. Now can you leave?" "Ah, Constance, your words sting worse than a lance," he exclaimed, taking on an almost playful tone as he gestured dramatically with his arms, first opening them up wide, then clutching at his heart. "Give me a chance. I really want to make it up to you. Maybe you could tell me about that book." "It's the Compendium of Light and Dark," she relented, although she closed it defensively. His gaze went to the front of the book. "Just some light reading, then," he said. "I think Annette has mentioned it before. It's pretty comprehensive, right?" "Yes. So far it has shed light on quite a few things. Although she had to admit that it was mainly Crow who had shed his light on them. It also poses questions I have yet been unable to answer, however." Sylvain leaned forward further, resting his chin on top of the backs of his hands. His eyes fully focused on her gleamed in tandem with his smile. "Yeah? Like what?" She scowled at him. As though he would understand any of the in-depth knowledge contained in this book. Well, he would soon realize that little fact himself, she supposed. "I am searching for a way to conceal ink," she said. "I already have some experience with light magic, and so I know that it can be used to manipulate what the naked eye can see. However, so far, I have yet to come up with a spell that has a lasting effect even after the mage has finished casting it." Sylvain said. "Is it for a diary or something?" Constance couldn't help but smile wryly. "Something along those lines. It needs to remain invisible until a corresponding spell is cast." "You working on a new formula then?" She paused. Then she reached for her notebook and turned it around so that he could read her notes. It was mostly just different formula variations, nothing sensitive. She watched Sylvain scan the page, mumbling something below his breath as he did. "I mean this with the utmost respect," he began after just a short moment, raising his gaze to meet hers. "But aren't you overcomplicating things just a little?" Constance frowned. "Excuse me." He turned the notebook back around and pointed at the last variant of the formula. "This is incredibly strong magic," he said. "Not that I'm surprised, I mean, you're amazing at this. But sometimes a simple solution is better than a complicated one, right?" She blinked at him, feeling as though her grip of the situation had begun to slip. "Such as?" Sylvain leaned back in his chair, considering the notebook from a distance. "What if you looked at it the other way around? Instead of using a spell to hide the writing, maybe you could use a spell to reveal it. The uncomfortable feeling kept growing the more he kept talking. She hadn't expected him to actually give useful advice. What was this? Why did Sylvain Gautier know anything about magic? I mean, what do I know? He continued with a small laugh when she didn't reply. I'm not a mage. He stood from his chair. Can I get you something? Tea, maybe. She looked up at him, considering the offer. I would much prefer coffee, she said, then sighed. However, I'm afraid it is a rare brew that isn't offered here. To her surprise, he smirked and gave her a wink. I'll see what I can find. Be right back. Constance watched him move along the rows of tables in the dining hall, but soon returned her attention to her notebook. If she looked at it the other way around, like he said, he was correct in that she wouldn't need as complicated a spell then. If she could make the writing invisible by design, she would only need a spell to reveal it, and that wouldn't demand nearly as much energy as a spell to keep the writing hidden. It only needed to be visible for long enough that she and Crow could read the other's notes. In other words, a few seconds at a time would be enough. That would definitely be manageable. All she needed was a way to create invisible ink, then, and a spell to reveal it. A spell obscure enough that no one but her and Crow would think to attempt it on the book. That should be no object. She had created so many custom spells at this point that she could do it in her sleep. By the time Sylvain returned, she was already nearing a solution. In fact, she had come to the conclusion that she was in no need of a custom spell after all. She had an idea for a special kind of ink with ingredients which would allow the ink to darken if exposed to electrical currents, and lightning magic should do the trick. Even if Crow knew little or no lightning magic, this would require only a very simple spell that he should be able to learn without much struggle. Coffee for the hard-working lady. Constance's eyebrows shot up underneath her bangs as she lifted her head and saw Sylvain placing a cup of the dark, steaming liquid in front of her. You how? He laughed. I went to fetch some from my room. I received it as a gift, but I'm not a huge fan of coffee. Not a fan of coffee, she exclaimed. But it carries such a striking, deep flavor, it is unlike anything else. Precisely, he said, wrinkling his nose as he sat down in the other chair again. I'm more for sweets. This is way too bitter. I'm glad you like it, though. Means it'll come to good use. Her cheeks warmed. Well, she said. Thank you. I suppose you aren't completely useless after all. He smiled. Nah, I'm still pretty useless. Without the coffee, I'm just an obnoxious flirt. She couldn't help but feel shame at his reply. She certainly had treated him as though he were just that. Thank you for your advice on the spell, she said sincerely. I had a breakthrough thanks to you. It was nothing, he assured her, smile fading. Though I'm glad I could help. She lifted the cup, bringing it to her lips. It was the perfect temperature, hot but not enough to scald. She closed her eyes as she enjoyed the round, deep flavor of the beverage, making the most of the moment. Returning the cup to the table, she let out a content, relaxed sigh. Marvelous. If you say so. She opened her eyes again to regard him. He sat leaned back in his chair with his gaze fixed on an invisible spot on the table, his expression completely humorless. I've been thinking, he began slowly as she took her next couple of sips, his voice so low now that she had to lean forward to hear him. About what you said in the library. About how I'm just making excuses, and how my behavior has nothing to do with what I'm capable of. He raised his gaze, it was uncertain. What did you mean by that? Constance set the cup down. She had told him that when she was upset, but she supposed that it held its truths. For one, you are clearly more competent than you pretend to be, she said, inclining her head to her notebook. Your behavior is simply an act. You pretend to be incompetent, for whatever reason, when in fact I believe you are quite clever. What I simply do not understand is why you abuse your noble title in such a way. You are fortunate, you know, to be a part of noble society. One day it might all come crumbling down. One corner of Sylvain's mouth quirked upward into a smirk, all uncertainty gone from his eyes. Heh. You're probably right. We'd both be houseless then, yeah. Her muscles tensed. He said that so easily, so simply, as though losing her noble status hadn't been the most traumatic experience of her life. Sylvain's smirk slowly melted off as he watched her reaction. Sorry. That was unusually tactless, even for me. He leaned forward, offering her his hands with his palms facing upward. She just stared at them, but he didn't withdraw them. If I could, Constance, he said lowly, gazing into her eyes with sincerity, I would trade with you. I'd do it in a heartbeat, believe me. She felt a strange surge in her chest at that comment, or perhaps at the almost hypnotizing tone of his voice. She nearly took his hands before she remembered that this was what he did. This was how he did it, how he lured all those women to follow him wherever he went. She knew his type. He and Yuri both were the kinds to plaster coy smiles on their faces but scowl in disgust as soon as their mark turned their back on them. Well, he wouldn't make a fool out of her. She raised her chin defiantly, looking down at him. Do you expect to charm me with such crude methods? How utterly disappointing. Nobility is surely wasted on you, Sylvain Gautier. His smile wavered somewhat as he pulled his hands back. Your words are as sharp as your intellect, my lady. Her eyes nearly rolled out of her head. Before she could respond, however, he stood and pushed the chair closer to the table. Well, this has been lovely, but I have a date with my self-loathing. He eyed the cup on the table, half empty now. Enjoy your coffee. With those final words, he turned on his heel and strode away, heading straight for the nearest doorway. Constance scowled in his direction until he was out of sight. Then she looked down at the cup, and a small sliver of remorse went through her. As soon as she had finished making the special ink and had written a note for Crow which she tucked in between 2 pages in the compendium, Constance set out to attempt Crow's challenge, adjusting the faith syntax. If the faith level theory is false, it shows that formulas and as a result, the faith syntax are not as rigid as the author claims. Have you attempted to manipulate the syntax yet? Coming up with new ways to use magic was perhaps Constance's favorite activity ever. From a young age, she had been complimented for her ability to see new possibilities in even the most mundane. She fondly remembered having surprised her parents by using lightning magic to reheat a meal when she was 8 years old, a memory which was only somewhat tainted by the burns she had ended up giving herself on her fingers as a result. Today, a few of them were discernible as faint scars, reminding her that she could accomplish anything if she set her mind to it. So what if it burned her? As long as the end result was a net positive, it had to be viewed as a success. However, she had never thought to manipulate any of the syntaxes before, a fact which, now that she considered it, was quite surprising. If anything, that should have been one of the first things she considered, no? Magic syntaxes were the rules of their respective field, the language in which to correctly phrase a formula. Constance's field of expertise was black magic, but since she had recently begun to dabble in faith magic as well, she knew very well that the syntaxes of the 2 fields were different from each other. They were not as different as she suspected that the dark magic syntax would be, but for one, black magic did not require prayers in order to complete a spell while faith magic was shaped around said prayers. Considering what she had recently learned about the faith level theory, however, she was beginning to suspect that perhaps that was not the entire truth. She decided to focus her attempts on this very part of faith magic, the prayers. They were what Crow had explicitly referred to in his notes so far, after all. Finding a secluded space in Abyss, Constance set to work. The faith syntax had a pattern of 3s, from the outside in, it consisted of 3 prayers, 6 celestial entities in 2 sets of major and minor, 6 channels of divine essence, and 18 ancient glyphs divided in 3 groups. These parts were then connected by a string of operators which specified the relationship between them. The major celestial entities were connected to everything else through cross-section, the minor ones were connected only to each other, the divine essence and the glyphs, and the prayers were what sealed everything else into a spell. At least, that was what she had been taught during her years in the Royal School of Sorcery. She had also been taught that all of the variables in the syntax, for example the channels of divine essence or celestial entities, could be changed. This was what formulas were for, and ultimately determined what spell would be cast. However, no one had ever said a word about adjusting the syntax itself. In fact, the compendium had gone so far as to outright declare it as impossible to even combine vastly different variables with each other. In other words, there were groups of celestial entities which could be considered to belong together, and combining two entities from groups that were very different was simply not viable according to the author. Constance had questioned that conclusion even before Crow came into the picture, but now, it seemed as though there were bigger, more vital questions to ask. What would happen if she completely excluded the prayers in a faith spell? That must be the first step in her research. She opened up the compendium and turned to the part on the faith syntax, letting her gaze quickly skim over the first few paragraphs until she reached what she was after. Indeed, the prayers are what complete the syntax, binding the strands of magic together and sending them off to the goddess, who shapes said strands into the correct spell. As explained in Chapter I, faith magic builds upon asking for and being offered help by divinity. Unlike reason magic, where the formula itself is the basis of the spell, thus requiring some measure of analytical prowess from the caster, the success of faith magic depends on the clarity of the formula as well as the caster's connection to the goddess and her teachings. Since the output of the spell is the result of divine interference, the faith syntax allows for more precise magic as well as an array of spells which would otherwise exist out of our grasp. Faith magic gives us a taste of the divine for ourselves, a gift that should not be taken for granted. To her great surprise, Constance noticed that there was a note from Crow in the margins, one that she had apparently missed before. What if the opposite is true? What if the prayers are what lock our own powers away? The faith syntax was created by the Church. Has anyone ever dared to question it? Constance had to read his note over several times, her mouth hanging open as her gaze flicked across the scribbles. He was treading dangerously close to heresy with this comment. But she could see that there was truth to these questions, blindly trusting the inventor of the faith syntax to tell the truth regarding its workings, when that very inventor clearly stood to gain from keeping things to themselves, was naive at best. Although, was that not what she had been doing up until Crow asked his first skeptical questions about faith in the margins? Had she ever before questioned the truths of faith magic? No, she thought with a measure of disappointment in herself, but on the other hand, faith magic had never been her specialty. Dipping her quill in the new special ink, she thought to scribble out a reply to Crow, but caught herself with the quill hanging in the air. Invisible ink dripped down onto the page as she paused to consider what she had just learned. Crow's notes were definitely forming a pattern at this point. There was no doubt that he was skeptical of the Church, and that he knew secrets about dark magic, but apart from that, she was beginning to see what he neglected to say between the lines. Formulas are mere tools, and so they are not rigid. What if the prayers are what lock our own powers away? Have you attempted to manipulate the syntax yet? Look to the elder arts. There was only one logical conclusion she could draw from his notes so far, a conclusion which he had been hesitant to spell out for her where anyone could read it. And now she could see why. It was a conclusion which, if it came out, could mean serious repercussions from the Church, perhaps even the punishment of death. The conclusion, that the creators of dark magic had somehow managed to cast faith magic without prayers. And that it had unlocked some kind of unmatched power. The quill dropped from her hand and rolled into the middle of the book, leaving a thin trail of invisible ink in the wake of its tip. Constance jerked her hands to her, holding them close to her chest in an attempt to stop them from trembling. Was that what dark magic was? Was that why some called it the magic of heathens? And if that was the case, could she possibly practice such magic? She stared down at the last note she had found from Crow. What if the prayers are what lock our own powers away? Yes, what if? If her assumptions were correct, this was only a rhetorical question, a question which Crow already knew the answer to, and which he expected Constance to figure out on her own. If her assumptions were correct, the prayers did indeed lock away her powers. And in that case, well, hadn't she sworn that she would unravel the mysteries of magic? That she would restore her house and become known as the greatest sorceress throughout history? Indeed she had. And if she turned her back on this opportunity to develop herself and her magical prowess to access previously unimaginable powers, then was she really worthy of the name of Novelli? Constance let out a long, shivering breath, her shoulders dropping markedly. No, there really was no alternative. She simply had to continue exploring this path, wherever it might take her. It would be idiotic to refuse aid from Crow when he so willingly shared his knowledge with her. This chance might never come again. Gripping the quill and turning to the page where Crow had first challenged her to manipulate the syntax, she rapidly scribbled down her assumptions about what he had intended for her to learn from the challenge. She didn't expect she needed to do an actual attempt at this point, and besides, she was now anxious to return the book to the library so that Crow would reply and tell her whether she was correct in her assumptions or not. As soon as she had finished, Constance returned the book to the library, along with a cryptic note on how to hide and reveal their notes which she hoped Crow would be able to interpret correctly. She had even managed to make their old notes invisible retroactively, with some clever spell work together with the completely transparent ink that she had created. She really had outdone herself this time. When allowed sufficient time to dry, no one would be able to tell that there was any ink in the margins. In the unlikely event that her magical prowess didn't reach the potential she was striving for, she could always go into chemistry instead. In the very unlikely event, that was. Chapter 4, A Necessary Evil, PT1. There, our communication is secure, which means that you can now be open with me. I do hope the lightning spell didn't prove too draining for you. I set out to experiment with the syntax, as you suggested. However, I never came far enough to actually attempt it. I didn't need to. I can read between the lines, and I see what you are trying to tell me. Dark magic, the kind that you call the Elder Arts, stems from faith magic. Someone manipulated the faith syntax and, in doing so, invented an entirely new kind of magic. Correct? Well, aren't you clever? This little trick with the ink is secure enough for our purposes, I suppose. However, if this ends up taking me down, you're going with me, Constance von Novelli. As for the lightning spell itself, in magic, there are always more ways than one to accomplish a single desired effect. In other words, I didn't need to use your spell. Now, as for the faith and elder syntaxes, you are indeed correct. Long, long ago, an ancient people turned their backs on the goddess. They adapted and developed faith magic into a new art for their own benefit, incorporating reasoning and technology into it. Then they utilized this amalgamation of magics to challenge the goddess and her followers, ultimately leading to the devastation of Fodlan. The Elder Arts are more similar to faith magic than what is generally taught to students such as yourself. Black magic is channeled from the outside and in, it draws its power from nature, and binds that power by help of the glyphs within the formula. Faith magic is channeled from the inside and out, with prayers binding the energy instead. Elder magic flows in the same direction as faith magic does, yet here the prayers are excluded completely. Instead, complex algebraic formulas bind the power of a spell. Elder magic is a twisted and adapted form of faith magic. While the Church's magic is based in faith in the divine and its mystical powers, elder magic is rooted in knowledge. Practitioners of elder magic throughout history have generally been scholars with a deep-seated need to explore the unknown. In other words, one might view elder magic as the antithesis to faith magic, a kind of magic with the aim of taming the power of the divine for our own. We use complex formulas to bend that power to our will. And because of that complexity, it offers a greater measure of control to the caster, leading also to greater risks. I must say, the way that you describe dark magic is intriguing. A deep-seated need to explore the unknown. Are you aware that you are describing me? The spell you use to uncover our communication, is it dark magic? I've always been warned that dark magic threatens to consume any who dare try to tame it, that to use it, one must invite darkness itself into one's soul. You clearly practice it, however, what does that say about you? I do know about your thirst for knowledge. I believe that thirst will aid you greatly in your studies of the Elder Arts. That is part of why I initiated contact with you. I did indeed use elder magic to uncover the invisible ink. The Elder Arts are especially well suited for revealing secrets. But to use a lightning spell for the same purposes. I must admit, I am impressed. It is not the magic itself that is dark. Elder magic can be used for good just as well as for evil. Although I must acknowledge that historically, practitioners of elder magic have often had nefarious aims. This can ultimately be traced back to the origins of the arts. As to where I fall on the spectrum between good and evil, I'm afraid you'll have to determine that for yourself. With all that said, are you afraid to learn more? Me? Do you even know whom you are addressing? I am Constance von Novelli. I do not shy away from danger. Regardless, darkness has always been a safe space for me. If there's anything which threatens to swallow me whole, it is the light. The light? And why is that? Oh, never mind that. Tell me more about the Elder Arts. Who were the people that betrayed the goddess? What do you mean by the devastation of Fodlan? Clearly it is not presently devastated. Are the history books on the War of Heroes not to be trusted? And perhaps most importantly, are you positing that the goddess does not exist at all? Certainly the goddess has once existed, and supposedly still exists. But do I believe that she is the one who binds the power of a faith spell? Hardly. The Church wants you to believe that their magic is a mysterious, arcane power, the truth of which lies beyond the grasp of ordinary human beings. In reality, magic is a science. It can be studied, it can be grasped, it can be manipulated. Surely you of all people should be aware of this. I cannot tell you more about the history of the Elder Arts at this point in time. What I can do is teach you the syntax. You will not find that information in any of the monastery's books, and while I challenged you to manipulate the faith syntax, it isn't quite so simple as merely exchanging the prayers for algebraic formulas. While the general idea and the direction of the magical energy are the same, Elder magic utilizes other kinds of signs and entities that you might be unfamiliar with. You will need to dedicate much of your time to studying the Elder syntax and formulas, including the arithmetics, before you can reliably cast Elder spells. In an attempt to achieve at least some sort of structure, I will continue this in the chapter on Dark Magic, CP. CCXL. Ugh. I do not have time for this. I assure you, I would never kidnap someone, and especially not someone affiliated with the Church. Ma'am, please, we're just exploring all possibilities. Constance huffed in indignation, refusing to listen to any more of the nonsense spouted by the knight currently blocking her path. Had she truly wanted to, he wouldn't have presented much of an obstacle, but the audacity with which he accused her of such heinous acts without any grounds could not be allowed to pass by unremarked. Exploring all possibilities, Oh yes, us Abyssinians are always the first suspects, are we not? How very convenient. What's going on here? Constance turned to see Yuri walking with precise steps toward them from the shadows in the nearby tunnel, cape swaying behind him. Yuri. Am I ever glad to see you? This knight from the surface is questioning Abyssinians as to the whereabouts of Flane. He is blocking my path, demanding that I tell him about my alibi since last night. Once again, the Church shows just how much faith they have in us. She turned back to glare at the knight. I assure you that I am just as worried as everyone else, but we have it all under control here. Right, Yuri. Yuri cocked his head to the side, sizing up the knight who was beginning to squirm under his gaze. Constance noticed with a flash of satisfaction that the way in which Yuri had calmly placed a hand on the hilt of his sword had not passed the knight by unnoticed. That's right, Yuri said. We're doing our own hunting. I've had some of my people search for her throughout the underground, but to no avail. You're welcome to search as well, but please leave the Abyssinians out of it unless you have just cause to question them. The knight moistened his lips, gaze moving between the two of them. He was clearly considering whether to follow his orders or do as the underground leader asked of him, a choice that, in Constance's eyes, should have been easy. When he didn't reply, Yuri silently raised his eyebrows, causing the knight to finally step to the side. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said before turning fully toward Yuri. I'll tell the others to keep to the tunnels and abstain from questioning civilians, if possible. Thank you, Yuri said, pulling one of his most pleasant smiles, which Constance instantly saw was faux. At least it did the trick. The knight scurried away around the corner, leaving them alone at last. Constance exhaled a long breath, turning to Yuri in exasperation. I grow weary of this, Yuri. As soon as something happens, the knights burst into abyss. Do we really stand so low in their eyes? He shook his head, then wrapped an arm around her shoulder and started leading her down the tunnel toward Burrow Street. Abyss is the town of fugitives, he said. You may not be among the shoddier ones, milady, forgive the pun, but we do have all kinds of criminals here. Besides, Abyss is a sprawling underground world that the Church is for the most part locked away from. Who knows how many hidden passageways exist down here, or anywhere around the monastery, for that matter. It makes sense to check them, yeah. She supposed there was some truth to his words. The moment that Flame, sister to the Archbishop's second-in-command, Seath had disappeared, a monastery-wide alert had gone out. All gates out of the monastery had been firmly shut, and knights swarmed even the surface in their search for the girl. Half a day had passed since then, but Constance had barely even caught word of Flame's disappearance before the knights had rumbled in through one of the few passageways remaining into Abyss. Yuri had found and blocked most of them soon after they'd made this their home, but the church naturally knew about the main one. I suppose, she relented. However, we do have an agreement with the church, correct? Yuri nodded slowly while they walked. We do. They won't interfere with our affairs so long as we don't interfere with theirs. But I'd say this is an acceptable exception to the rule. And in fact, some of the people I've talked to today have admitted to seeing strange things. He paused. Well, unusually strange things, for Abyss. Someone mentioned an old guy with a staff, someone else a masked man carrying a sickle. Something weird's definitely going on. They had now reached the edge of the main street. Here, Yuri slowed their pace, stepped in front of her and gently gripped her shoulders. You should go see what you can do to help. Show some good faith. He looked over his shoulder, briefly scanning the people walking along Burrow Street. Myself, I'm going to check on Happy. I'm worried this whole thing brings back bad memories for her. He glanced back toward her for a moment to flash her a quick smile, then patted her shoulder before starting to stroll toward the street. Good luck with the search. Thank you, Constance replied before sighing and going after him, although she steered her steps toward the main entrance instead. She felt slightly ashamed that she wasn't more worried about Flame's disappearance. Constance had yet to even speak with the girl, and so while she knew that she was incredibly important to the Archbishop and Seath, feelings of worry or fear did not come naturally to her. In truth, and this was not something she would ever confess if confronted about it, the whole ordeal was an annoying distraction from her elder magic studies. Finally, Crow had begun to teach her the fundamentals. It was slow in the beginning, since she had never even touched on the subject before, but the more she learned, the more she realized just how similar elder magic was to faith magic. Perhaps if she had studied faith magic for as long as she had studied black magic, she might have had an easier time with it. Or possibly not, considering that the most difficult part of elder magic so far had turned out to be the algebra. Her black magic studies had introduced her to some basic arithmetic concepts, but this was on an entirely different level. Crow spoke of things she had never even heard of before, square roots, exponents, equations. And whenever she complained, he reminded her that the algebra was the very part of elder magic which enabled the caster to unlock true power. Without it, there was no purpose in attempting to use elder magic. Naturally, this leads to a considerably higher complexity compared to the other two magic types, Crow had told her in the margins. Faith magic and black magic utilize a higher level of abstraction, while elder magic is tied very closely to the primal sources of magic. However, this complexity is also what allows us to go straight to that source and take advantage of the full extent of its power. Of course, Constance was not a quitter. She was rather the opposite, in fact, so much so that she had lost quite a lot of sleep in the past 2 weeks. Not that the algebra was the only perpetrator in that matter. Oh, no. When she wasn't lying in her bed at night thinking about algebraic expressions, she was kept awake by thoughts of Crow and what his true identity might be. She could already exclude the rest of the Ashen Wolves, her comrades in Abyss. For one, she had determined that it couldn't be Yuri. He had little interest in this kind of research, and there was nothing whatsoever in his manner these days which suggested that he was keeping such a gigantic secret from her. Besides, Yuri knew about her affliction with sunlight, but Crow had asked her what she meant when she referred to it. That also excluded Balthus as well as Happy, even though Happy did know a fair bit of dark magic. Constance knew that Happy used her powers begrudgingly. She would never dig this deeply into something which brought her so many painful memories. No, it had to be a surface dweller, or possibly someone she didn't know in Abyss. Due to Crow's clear dismay with the church, it was highly unlikely that he was one of the church's supporters. That excluded most faith mages, except for the ones who were in it for entirely different reasons, such as Linhard, whose two main purposes in life seemed to be research and naps. Yes, Linhard had not yet been eliminated from her list of possible identities. Neither had Sylvain. He clearly knew more about magic than he was letting on, and he didn't seem too infatuated with the church either. There could definitely be something dark hiding beneath that flirtatious exterior. Apart from that, she was still in the dark. Until she knew more about Crow, she wouldn't be able to figure out his true identity. Which, while slightly aggravating, was something she could live with for now. Exiting the hidden entryway to Abyss, Constance caught sight of Professor Byleth. He was striding purposefully toward the entrance, but stopped as their gazes locked. Constance walked up to meet him. It wouldn't do to converse at length right outside such an important secret. "Professor," she said. "Are you searching for Flayn, as well?" Byleth nodded. "Have you seen anything out of the ordinary lately, Constance?" Constance sighed dramatically, taking out her fan and extending it with a flick of her wrist before slowly beginning to fan herself. "If by anything out of the ordinary, you mean a herd of Cero's knights falling over themselves to accuse us of the disappearance with little regard for either our integrity or rules of evidence, then yes, I have seen it." To her aggravation, the professor smiled. "I understand why that would be annoying, but I'm sure they don't mean to put any blame on you. We are all just doing our best to find Flayn." Yes, I know," Constance relented, suddenly grateful for the cool breeze created by her fan. "We do have our fair share of shady characters coming and going." "Professor." Constance raised her gaze at the same time as Byleth turned toward the voice. The hot-headed boy in their house, Casper, had come to a halt in his run just a few feet away. It wasn't foreign to see the boy running around from time to time, but this once he was panting so hard that his nostrils fluttered, and if Constance hadn't known better, she would have said his eyes were glowing red. "Casper! You need to hurry." I heard a scream from Professor Juritzaw's room. "Edelgard and the others are already on their way." Before he had even finished speaking, the professor had taken off in the direction of the teacher's quarters. Casper wasn't far behind. Constance hesitated for a second should she get involved or not, before quickly deciding that whatever they would find at their destination might require her magical prowess. She tucked away her fan and began to run. Since she usually went to battle on top of a Pegasus, Constance was not nearly as physically fit as Byleth or Casper. She lagged behind more and more for each second, and when she finally arrived outside Professor Juritzaw's room, the others had already had more than enough time to take in the scene. All of the Black Eagles were there, blocking Constance's vision inside the room. She tried to stand on her tiptoes to at least catch a glimpse, but to no avail. "Is she injured?" Byleth asked, sounding perfectly calm and not at all out of breath. It was entirely unfair. "She's unconscious," Edelgard's serious voice replied from inside the room. "Someone clearly attacked her." "Look at her hand," she heard Hubert's voice say next. "It looks as though she is pointing at something. There. There's an opening behind that shelf. Perhaps a secret passageway." "Does this mean Professor Juritzaw did it?" Casper Whisper shouted. "Could he also have kidnapped Flayn?" "We need to take Manuela to the infirmary," Byleth said firmly. "Edelgard. Will you help me carry her?" "Understood. I'll support her head." Constance moved out of the way together with the rest of the Black Eagles as Byleth and Edelgard carried an unconscious Professor Manuela out of Juritzaw's room. From what Constance could see, there were no visible marks on her, but she looked as pale as a ghost. "What in the world?" Constance breathed. "We will be back shortly," Byleth said, pausing outside the room for a moment to give them all a serious look. "Be careful. Don't do anything rash." Before they left, Constance saw Edelgard send a significant look toward Hubert. What it meant, she could only surmise. As soon as the princess and the professor were out of sight, Edelgard's retainer immediately took command. "We need to investigate this passageway," he said, striding further into the room. The group of students had dispersed enough that Constance could now walk inside and see the scene for herself. The room was in a disarray, with a bookcase knocked to the side and all of the books sprawled on the floor. Behind where the bookcase had been was a gaping hole leading downward into darkness. "Shouldn't we call for the knights?" the perpetually anxious Bernadetta asked. "We don't have time," Hubert said. "It would be on us if the culprit escaped." It is also likely that we will find Flayn at the end of this path. If she has been taken hostage, she should be alive, at least for now. There would be no point to abducting her if simple murder was the objective. However, the longer we dawdle here, that settles it, Casper exclaimed. We'll take the offensive. Here we come, you monsters. With that, he ran straight into the opening in the wall, his steps echoing off the walls all the way down the path. Ferdinand and Petra ran in right after him. Linhard yawned before following. Bernadetta looked as if she was ready to faint, but Dorothea locked arms with her and gave her a few words of courage, and then they walked together into the darkness. All Constance could think was, did that path lead down into abyss? Had the perpetrators used her place of refuge for their nefarious deeds all this time? Was Yuri aware of this entryway into his city of misfits? Hubert watched as they all entered the dark entrance. When only he and Constance were left, he turned his piercing gaze toward her. Shall we? Constance blinked at him. If this did indeed lead down into abyss, then as a citizen of that town and as the right hand to its leader, she had a responsibility to clear her fellow Abyssians from any suspicion and protect her class from any dangers that might lurk in the shadows. Straightening subconsciously with these conclusions, Constance found herself smirking at Hubert, whose gaze was still locked to hers. Indeed we shall. As she watched him, a crooked smirk slowly grew on his lips. He scoffed and turned to the hole in the wall. Come on, then. As the other Black Eagles took in the dusky underground chamber in awe, Constance swallowed down an uncomfortable lump of anxiety. She knew this terrain, this was definitely a part of Abyss. Yet she had never before seen this place, and she doubted that Yuri had, either. She let her gaze move across the dark stone panels on the floor. She recognized one of them as a warp panel, others as healing panels. She came to a stop when her gaze reached Hubert, however. While he was looking around just as the others, something about his facial expression made her pause. He didn't look speechless or awe-inspired, he simply looked perplexed. I never would have imagined. This place is. Look. There's Flayn. And. Is that another student? Constance looked where Ferdinand was pointing, only to notice for the first time that part of one of the walls was decorated with a long row of bars, offering plenty of sight into the smaller room on the other side. Peering through them, she could see that two figures were indeed lying unconscious on the stone floor on the other side, next to a group of crates, a long table and chairs that looked as though they had been haphazardly placed along parts of the table. One of the unconscious figures had light, almost greenish hair in thick braids. If that wasn't Flayn, she didn't know who it could possibly be. The other student she couldn't recognize, however, she was too far away. Something moved in the corner of that room, and the other students seemed to notice it around the same time as she did, for they all crouched down in an attempt to hide from the line of sight of the man on the other side of the bars. Constance held her breath as she watched Death himself stride toward a horse as black as his armor, expertly wielding his long scythe even as he mounted the stallion. He glanced toward the unconscious girls, revealing a face covered by a dark skull mask with horns. Constance could feel Bernadetta trembling beside her. She reached out in an attempt to reassure her, but it had the opposite effect. The girl shrieked and jumped several inches in the air. The Death Knight's head snapped around to locate the source of the noise, and for the longest moment in Constance's life, the red gaze from his mask locked with hers. She saw him raise an armored hand, and in the next second, a purple glowing magic circle appeared on the ground below him. Even though her muscles were frozen, her mind rapidly took in the algebra along the outer parts of the circle. Elder magic. Constance. Something hard and heavy shoved her out of the way a fraction of a second before the dark spell zinged past where she had just stood. She let out an involuntary grunt as her back hit the hard stone floor, squeezing her eyes closed at the sudden pain. A hand shook her shoulder, causing her eyes to flutter open again. Ferdinand was crouched above her, his own eyes wide and searching. Are you all right? She blinked up at him, mind in a strange kind of haze. Yes, she said. Thank you. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that the others had moved away further into the chamber, where battle had begun with a group of unknown enemies. Sounds of swords clashing and spells whistling through the air already filled the chamber, bouncing off the walls. Ferdinand stood and extended a hand to her. She stared at it, mind still reeling, until he grabbed her hand and pulled her to her feet. She groaned as her back protested slightly. But she knew this kind of pain, it would not last for long. "Who are you?" Ferdinand asked, searching her face intently. She parted her lips, grasping after something in her mind. "I am Constance von Novelli." Apparently that was the correct response, for his eyes filled with determination. "Exactly. So show them the might of your magic." With that, he was off to join the others, pulling an axe off a holster on his back as he ran. Even without his trusty steed, Ferdinand von Aegir was a force to be reckoned with. And so was she. She could consider the implications of the elder magic-wielding Death Knight later. Right now, she needed to stay on the alert and get her classmates through the catacombs safely. Taking a deep breath, she ran after Ferdinand. She passed Bernadetta and Linhard first. They were both taking cover behind two pillars, though neither of them shunned their responsibilities. Bernadetta, while panting in fear as she gathered her courage, soon leaned out from her hiding spot to fire several well-aimed arrows toward another archer. And Linhard didn't even have to peer out behind the pillar to cast his healing spells, he could do it with his eyes closed. Caspar was the furthest ahead, along with Ferdinand, who just now came to his rescue by using his axe to block a lance aimed at Caspar's head. Petra was dueling another sword fighter, and Dorothea stood further to the right, covering the others with her black spells. Constance headed toward the left side of the room, only to be stopped by an arm shooting out right in front of her. "Stay back," Hubert commanded her while raising his other arm to cast a fire spell at one of the archers currently bothering Linhard. "Get behind cover." Constance would have argued with him, were it not for the lethal attacks raining down all around her. An arrow landed just beside her right foot. She dodged to the left and quickly gathered the natural strands of magic around her to channel a lightning spell that she fired back at the archer. He stumbled back with a yell before falling over in spasms, no doubt meeting a painful electrical death. Hubert gave her a quick glance. "A fine display, I'll readily admit." She nonchalantly flipped her hair, although she couldn't help but smile. "Peerless, as usual." His gaze moved away again. "Now get back. You're too fragile." Constance scoffed as he stepped in front of her and fired another magical projectile toward an enemy. "Fragile? Really now?" She nearly pushed him aside again, but then thought better of it. She may not agree with Hubert's sentiments, but in the absence of Edelgard and the professor, the tactician of the Black Eagles was also their commander. So instead, she stepped back into the cover of a pillar, throwing out her arms to gather more magic strands from her surroundings. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of battle fade as she concentrated on the targets she could feel nearby, lightning magic already sparking in her open palms. Her classmates had the closest ones under lock and key, so she could safely focus on one further ahead. She locked onto another mage. From this distance, few could counter her attacks. With a smile, she channeled the magic into the correct formula for a bolting spell. Feeling the magical energy surge through her body, she leaned her head back and raised her hands up straight toward the sky, forming the magic into a focused orb of electricity. She clapped her hands together, throwing her arms out with a yell as she sent the magic toward its target several rooms away. Even from such a distance, she could feel the familiar tingles throughout her body as the spell hit home and fried the mage through and through. She opened her eyes with a smirk, letting the sounds around her return with full force. "A worthy death," she said, although the spell had taken a toll on her, and she had to shoot out a hand to support herself against the pillar. The strongest lightning spells she knew were so powerful they could drain her completely unless she paced herself, and that absolutely wouldn't do in a situation as lethal as this one. There was one advantage to allowing herself a short break, however: she had the time to consider how to go about the battle. While Hubert was both their tactician and their commander in this instance, Constance was without a doubt the most knowledgeable about their surroundings. While her classmates busied themselves with fighting off the nearest foes, she carefully scouted the area. Up ahead, and where Hubert was likely leading them, was a firmly closed gate. Through its bars, she could see what looked like a narrow corridor leading to more gates. Knowing Abyss, these catacombs could very well be labyrinth-like in their design. If their foes knew which paths led where, which they likely did, that would spell an enormous disadvantage for the Black Eagles. Not to mention that the gate, as of right now, was likely locked, meaning that the mages on the other side could keep safely casting spells at them while they attempted to unlock it. Was there any way that they could overcome that disadvantage, and surprise the Death Knight somehow? She looked to her right, from whence they had come. She had seen 2 warp panels so far, one in this room and one in the room they had first entered, but only the first one looked active. Trying it would be risky, especially since it might very well be a trap. But in the slight chance that it wasn't. Turning to look around the other corner, she sent a harmless spray of ice toward the floor in front of Hubert, hoping to catch his attention. Even as he kept firing spells, his head turned and his gaze snapped to hers. His eyes, which so very much reminded her of those of a reptile, asked her a clear question. "What?" "I recognize the traps and devices around here," she called, back pressed against the pillar. "I believe I know an alternate path." He dodged to the side, closer to her, just as an arrow was fired straight toward his chest. Retorting with another blast of fire, he merely glanced at her as the opponent fell. "Do it," he said. "Take Petra with you." "What? But she is the only one who can pick locks." "Exactly," he interrupted while casting another spell, his gaze fixed on the enemy. "And you might need her." He called for Petra's attention. "Macnieri. Go with Constance." The other girl nodded firmly, sheathed her sword in her bow and began running toward them. Trusting the tactician to have a solid reason for his choice, Constance led the way, dodging spells and arrows on the battlefield as she guided Petra back to the very first room. She didn't stop running until she stood by the stone panel in the innermost corner. It glowed with a faint pattern that she recognized from the ones she had seen in Abyss. Which, considering that these chambers were likely part of Abyss, was to be expected. Petra eyed her warily. "How am I knowing that I am not running into a trap?" Constance briefly considered reaching out with her magic to search for targets, but it would be of little help, since she had no way of knowing where the warp panel led. "I'm afraid you don't," she said simply. Then she stepped onto the panel, readying a spell even as she felt the familiar feeling of ancient magic envelop her. As it covered her eyes in temporary darkness, she had the stray thought that perhaps the warp panels were crafted with elder magic. She sprang forward as soon as she found herself in a new chamber, locking eyes with an armored knight who jumped as she appeared. As she fired the first ice spell she could think of, freezing both feet of her foe, she had the thought that if this was a trap, it certainly wasn't a well-planned one. After ending the man's life with another spell aimed at his head, she reached out with her magic to sense her surroundings, but could feel no immediate threats around her. Had they posted a single man to guard this room? How far away had they warped? She couldn't even sense her housemates anymore. For a moment, the room was eerily silent, now that the single foe inside of it lay dead at her feet. Then Petra appeared behind her, stumbling to the side and catching herself against the wall. She stared at the dead knight for a second or two before her gaze flickered up to meet Constance's. "That was fast," she said. "I expected a surprise attack," Constance replied, placing her hands on her hips. Apparently he didn't. Petra looked like she was about to say something, but then one of her hands shot up to grab at her head as a grimace twisted her features. Constance considered giving her a moment, since she knew firsthand how disorienting the first time using a warp panel could be, but the thought of the ongoing battle made her decide to push on. The room narrowed into a long corridor lit by wall-mounted candelabras. Constance gestured for Petra to follow her before moving into a half-run down the corridor, hands ready to fire if needed. The corridor made 2 sharp turns to the left, hiding no more foes, before eventually ending with another warp panel. Petra made a small huff in displeasure. "The first time is always the worst," Constance assured her before stepping onto the panel. This time, she barely had time to gauge her new surroundings before an arrow flew straight toward her face. She yelled, throwing up a barrier of ice in front of her without thinking. The arrow helplessly bounced off the ice and plinked off into the wall beside her. A sharp breath and the sound of an arrow being pulled from a quiver behind her told her that Petra had arrived sooner this time, and so she stepped to the side and started on a new spell while her housemate fired 3 arrows in rapid succession. Their opponent dodged out of the way for the first 2, but Petra must have anticipated the movement, for the third arrow buried itself in the other archer's upper arm. As he screamed and stumbled to the side, a trembling hand going to the arrow lodged in his flesh. Constance let out a gleeful laugh. That shall do nicely. Just for good measure, she fired an attack of her own, a lightning spell that made quick work of the opponent, who fell to the floor in spasms. She much preferred to take lives with lightning rather than with ice, since the former tended to be much less gruesome than the latter. Letting her ice barrier melt into water and wash away into the floor drains along the wall, Constance strode over to the archer and carefully used her magic to sense for any life signs. She couldn't sense any from him, but there was another figure somewhere nearby. "We are not alone," she told Petra. The other girl nodded before walking over to the gate at the end of the corridor. She tried the handle, but it didn't seem to budge. Getting down on her knees, she pulled out her lock-picking tools from a pouch and got to work on the lock. "Cover me. I shall take it from here," she assured her with a smile. She had been able to narrow down the location of the figure she sensed now. It was on the other side of the wall, probably in the next room. From the feel of it, it must be another archer, for it made a movement as if drawing arrows from a quiver on its back. As Petra stood and tucked her tools away, Constance leaned in and lowered her voice. "Archer in the next room. I'll distract them as we enter." "All right," she said, tugging the gate open. Together, they made their way through another corridor and defeated the remaining archer, and after another locked gate that Petra picked in a few seconds, they arrived in a large open chamber much different from the narrow corridors they had come from. She could sense no one else in the room, but the first thing Constance saw was a large lever nearby that she recognized as the kind of contraption that would enable or disable traps in the more dangerous parts of Abyss. Other than that, there were several inactive warp panels along the walls. She could count to 6 all in all, tucked into neat little pockets between walls that jutted out just a few feet. "If I were to make an educated guess, I'd wager that switch will activate the warp panels," she mused aloud. Petra made a move toward the switch. "No!" Constance exclaimed, causing the other girl to freeze halfway there and turn to her in confusion. "But this will make the others able to come to us, yes?" Constance's gaze flickered between the warp panels in the room. "Yes," she allowed, "but the same will be true for our opponents. If this switch activates all of the warp panels, we could quickly be swarmed by foes from all directions. Not to mention, we have no idea which panels lead where." Petra hesitated, then nodded, and took a step back again. "Yes. What do we do?" Constance took a deep breath and tried to think. Should they just risk it? Judging by the actions of their opponents so far, they didn't seem to have planned for any of this, or they would have been better prepared for her and Petra. It could be that none of them would know what to do when the panels activated. On the other hand, the fact that they had stationed a handful of foes in the corridors leading into this room told her that they were aware of both the panels and the switch. They couldn't possibly have neglected to take them into account. And if the Death Knight had managed to kidnap Flayn and another student completely unnoticed, then he must be intelligent enough to plan for the event that someone would find them and attempt to use the warp panels. But they had come this far, and there was no alternative. They needed to activate the switch. The question then was, what could they do to mitigate the risks? She gathered the strands of magic around her to prepare a spell. "I close off all of the paths except 2, she said. "We activate the switch, and take 1 path each. If they are a dead end, or if we run into enemies on the other side, we warp back and close off those paths before trying new ones. If one of us finds the room where our housemates are, we tell them to use the warp panel so we can reunite in this room and try the next panels together. Surely one of these panels must lead somewhere past the first gate." "Agreed," Petra said, drawing her sword. "Which path am I taking?" Constance shot out her hands in front of her to build a large and thick ice barrier in front of one of the paths, making sure to block it off completely before moving on to the next one. After 3 of them, she had to take a moment to breathe, leaning against a wall for support. She wasn't used to expending so much energy in so short a time, but it was absolutely crucial that no mere sword or arrow could break through the ice. If another ice or fire mage entered the room, the barrier would be water in an instant, but at least it was better than nothing. As she recharged, she pointed toward the very first panel from the left. "I take this one," she said, then pointed to the one beside it, "and you take that one. We have no clues to tell us which panel goes where, so we'll simply have to try them in order." Petra walked up to the panel she'd been assigned. Ready when you are. Constance pushed off from the wall and gathered more strands of magic from around her to create one last barrier of ice. She was panting when it was over, but there was no time to rest now. They had no idea how their housemates were doing. For all she knew, they could be about to be defeated any moment. Emanuele, she thought to herself with a decisive nod as she walked up to the switch. I can do this. With a grunt, she pulled the switch toward her. It made a satisfying clicking sound, and then all of the warp panels around them lit up all at once. Go, she called to Petra, who immediately stepped onto the warp panel in front of her. Hopefully the third time wouldn't be as disorienting to her as the first. Constance ran toward the first little nook and onto her own panel, closing her eyes as the familiar darkness enveloped her. She had learned through the years that it helped somewhat with the motion sickness. When she opened her eyes again, two other pairs of eyes met them. She quickly gauged her opponents, two mages, already readying their spells. This was a new room, nowhere close to her housemates it seemed, and her only options were to stay and fight or to step back onto the panel. But as she did the latter, she quickly realized she had forgotten one vital piece of information. The warp panels needed at least a few seconds to recharge before they could be used again. She threw herself to the side, more clumsily than she would have liked, just before two sets of spells shot out toward where she had just stood. Her gaze was drawn to the circles beneath the mage's feet. Elder magic. To say that she was inexperienced in fighting this kind of foe would be an understatement. She might have fought many mages in the past, but never before one who knew elder magic. She allowed herself a quiet curse word over how stupid she had been to never practice fighting with Happy. She'd fought Yuri many times, but for some reason the idea of practicing with Happy had never hit her. In the end, though, elder mages couldn't be much different than faith or black mages, right? Too worn out to dodge a second time, she brought up a thin ice barrier instead, but it was shattered in less than 5 seconds. Casting a second one, she pushed herself to her feet and stumbled back toward the warp panel. Just a few more steps. Of course, she might just run into even more foes back in the warp room, but she had to do something. She couldn't fight in this sorry state. What had she been thinking? Certainly she was one of the strongest mages at Garreg Mach, but even she had her limits. Spells bounced against the walls around her, her ice barrier keeping her safe from harm for now. As she stepped onto the panel and felt the magic begin to envelop her, however, she heard the terrible crash of ice shattering, and in the moment that the panel began to transport her, something hit her clean in the back of her right thigh. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was completely swallowed by the magic as it wrapped around her body, drowning everything out but the pain. Chapter 5, A Necessary Evil, PT2. Constance screamed out, staggering forward blindly as the magic released its hold and she arrived back in the warp room. Disoriented by the pain in her thigh, she stumbled into another body, hands immediately locking around her upper arms like vices. She was just about to form a spell to protect herself when a familiar voice called out nearby. Constance. Petra. She wasn't the one holding her, however, and judging by the concern in her voice, Constance might very well have stepped right into the arms of another elder mage. Her hands crackled with electrical energy, ready to attack, even though all she wanted to do was curl up on the floor and whine at the sharp pain in her thigh. She gasped, trying to catch her breath, I will not go down so easily. Save your energy, a male voice commanded above her. Gritting her teeth, she looked up at the face of the man who had locked her in place with his hands. Two light green lizard eyes stared down at her from a face framed by curtains of dark hair. Hubert. All at once, she let go of the magic and allowed her muscles to go slack. It wasn't so much a conscious decision as it was an attempt by her body to save itself from burning out completely. Hubert's grip was strong enough to stop her from collapsing to the floor. Instead, he carefully lowered her down until she was lying on her back with her legs straight. Linhard, he demanded. The back of her leg. On it. Constance let out a trembling breath as Linhard crouched down beside her and she felt his white magic begin to warm her thigh. She didn't know how bad it was, and she didn't want to know. She trusted that Linhard would be able to heal it. Her mind already a bit clearer, she blinked up at Hubert, who had his gaze focused on the warp panel she had just come through. I can close it off, she offered weakly, causing his gaze to return to her. Don't be reckless, he snapped. You've depleted your energy. We'll take it from here. Before she could answer, he turned his head to bark commands at what she presumed to be the rest of the Black Eagles. Constance sighed and closed her eyes. She didn't like being told she couldn't go on, but this time she simply didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, she listened as Petra explained what Constance had said about the warp panels earlier, then let herself be carefully pulled back to her feet when Linhard had finished healing her. It was a strange thing, being healed by magic. While she could somehow sense the memory of pain clearly, she knew that it was just a ghost and not real. No agony shot through her when she shifted her weight onto the right leg. Hubert let go of her and took a step back to gauge her strength. She smiled and straightened her back, hoping it would give off the impression that she could continue fighting, but it clearly didn't fool him. "We don't have time to get you back to safety," he said, "but you need to stay out of danger for the rest of this battle. And that's final," he added when she opened her mouth to argue. She promptly closed it again. Fine. She would stay behind the others, but if he thought that she would just watch from the sidelines, he was sorely mistaken. Hubert made as if to turn, then paused, and glanced back at her. "You did well." As he turned away fully this time, Constance silently huffed in exasperation. She did well? Without her, they would still be stuck in front of the very first gate. Hubert melted the barrier to the next warp panel, giving Constance one last glance before stepping onto it. She watched as the others followed suit, and was fully prepared to go last, but then Ferdinand stepped behind her in line. "I've got your back," he assured her in that confident voice of his, and she didn't have the energy to bother arguing, so she simply accepted it and stepped onto the panel before him. This warp panel turned out to lead into another large room filled with enemies. Acknowledging that her energy reserves were low, Constance dove in behind the nearest cover and kept watch over her housemates as they fought. Led by Hubert, the other Black Eagles managed to defeat all of the remaining enemies and push through to the other end of the room. Using her lightning magic, Constance determined that Flame was in the next room. Only a locked gate in solid wood stood in their way. "I can have it be opened," Petra offered helpfully, pulling out one of her lock picks. Hubert waved for her to lower her hand. "Don't go near the gate. There may be traps waiting for us." He looked over his shoulder. "Bernadetta." Eek. Constance watched as the tiny archer slipped behind Dorothea, trembling in fear of the tactician. Whatever Hubert had wanted to ask of her, the look on his face now showed that he was quickly reconsidering his alternatives. As his gaze moved across the group, Constance took a step forward, drawing everyone's gazes to her. "Fear not," she exclaimed with a triumphant smile, even as she threw out her arms to begin a bolting spell. "I shall cast one of my mightiest spells directly at the knight. Grant me but a puny 5 seconds, and I shall cause his heart to beat its last in my magical grip." Only a handful of sparks had gathered in her hands when Hubert strode up to her and clasped her arms to her sides, interrupting her spell. She glared, about to scold him, but the fury in his face stopped her. His eyebrows were tightly knit together over his eyes, his upper lip twitching almost as if he was about to growl at her. "Are you mad?" His fingers dug painfully into her upper arms, causing her to let out an involuntary whimper in pain. He released her then, but his anger did not falter. "What part about, you've depleted your energy, is it that you don't understand? If you cast a powerful spell right now, you may very well die from the exertion." Perhaps she should have stepped down. Right now, he was their commander. And yet something about the way he spoke to her made her want to challenge this mantle of authority he had so easily clasped around his shoulders. Something about the way he assumed things about her made her even more determined to disprove him. Instead of backing down, she raised her chin defiantly. "Thank you for your concern," she said coldly, "but I believe I know my limits." She already felt like she had regained much of her power. Perhaps she was not at her very best, but she was certainly strong enough to cast one spell. His nostrils flared. "Are you so stupidly stubborn that you are willing to risk your own life? Watch out!" Casper called. Constance's gaze flicked to the gate behind Hubert's back just as it burst off its hinges, flying straight toward them. She reacted on pure instinct, throwing her arms out and calling on the magic around her to create a barrier of ice around the two of them. The gate crashed into the barrier and shattered the ice before continuing straight into Hubert's back, sending him flying into her. They slammed into the wall on the other side of the room, pain blasted through her back and air whooshed out of her lungs, and if she had been able to scream, she would have, as the agony was so intense that everything around her went dark. "I've broken every last bone in my body. I must have." In the distance, sounds of battle could be heard, although she had no way of determining how her housemates were faring. A voice called her name from far away, then Hubert's name. She tried to move, but aside from the pain shooting through her spine, another body weighed her down as well, crushing her lungs inside her chest. Was he? "Relax," the voice said, nearer now, and she could recognize it as Linhard. "It will all be over soon." She whimpered as the tingling warmth of white magic touched her skin a second time before digging deeper, reaching for her bones, and she forced herself to do as he said and relax. Slowly, the agony unfurled and diminished, Linhard's magic bringing back her other senses as it relieved her of the worst pain. A low groan sounded near her ear, and then she felt Hubert move. He carefully pushed himself up onto his hands above her, allowing her to draw new oxygen into her lungs, and although it still hurt to move, the relief of being able to breathe freely was without comparison. She looked up and met a gaze that was as hard and cold as ice, before it softened somewhat as Hubert let out a sigh and then a pained groan, with his face twisting into a wince. "You'll be fine," Linhard said. "Just try not to move too much." "I need to." His magic faded together with his voice as he left them to themselves once again, no doubt running to heal someone else in the midst of battle. One glance to her left told her that her housemates were still holding their own against the last couple of enemies, but who knew how long that would last. Hubert sat back on his knees beside her and offered her a hand. Her first instinct was to glare suspiciously, but she had learned her lesson. They were still in the midst of battle, and she couldn't afford to be petty. She took his hand and let him pull her up, first into a sitting position, and then all the way to her feet. When she wobbled slightly, he reached out to grab her left elbow with his other hand, steadying her. "Thank you," she mumbled as she pulled back, letting the gentle press of his hands fade as they fell from her. Her gaze was drawn to the remains of the gate spread out around them. It had seemingly split in two larger parts before splintering further after the first impact. Hubert must have taken a horrible hit to his back. "You likely saved our lives with your ice spell," he said, as though he had heard her thoughts. "I can appreciate that. Even though this wouldn't have happened if you had stayed in line and not given in to your hubris." She scoffed. "If I recall correctly, you were the one who turned your back on the enemy." "Yes, how thoughtless of me," he drawled, his noble lilt making it sound as though he had dipped his words in viscous sarcasm before uttering them. "Now if you'll excuse me, I believe I'm needed elsewhere." He raised his right hand and, with a well-practiced flick of his wrist, warped himself away from her and into the thick of battle. Never having mastered such arts herself, Constance ran toward the others, wincing at the remnants of pain flashing in her body as she did. She stopped well out of range of any of the enemy attacks, knowing that she would never survive a hit in this state. From outside the final room, she could not see how many enemies were left undefeated. She would need to resort to her sixth sense. Closing her eyes, she tried to gather the strands of magic around her into a spell, tried feeling around for the knight, to see whether he was still alive. It drained more energy than usual to simply channel the magic, but after several painful moments, she had gathered enough magic that she could identify each of the bodies nearby. There was Hubert, and the other Black Eagles, moving quickly as they dodged attacks and fired their own in return. And there was another figure, only one, unidentified but shining bright with power. It must be the Death Knight. She zeroed in on his shape and prepared to send a last bolt of lightning toward him, even if it would mean her death when something else caught her attention. She could sense Edelgard in the chamber. At first, she thought that perhaps it was just a hallucination of sorts, or a misinterpretation. Her lightning magic was strong, but it could not reliably identify someone to a certainty of 100%. Instead, it relied on simple cues which Constance had learned to interpret and which usually gave her more accurate readings the better she knew the target. If her target was a housemate, then the fact that she had fought alongside them and learned their quirks would usually mean that she could estimate their identity even through her magic. Edelgard was one of the easiest to sense, since Constance had studied her in more detail, and thus the sounds around her were always dampened when she went into this mental state, but now everything was eerily silent. She opened her eyes, expecting everything to rush back to her, but all she could hear was muffled speaking. She half ran, half stumbled the last distance until she reached the doorway where the wooden gate had been. Between the backs of Dorothea and Bernadetta, she discerned Hubert and the knight, as well as a third figure, who was clad in black and red garbs and a masked helmet with a long, red plume extending backward from its top and falling in an arc toward the floor. As Constance watched, the Death Knight made a similar gesture as the one Hubert had made earlier, then disappeared as he warped himself out of sight. The garbed stranger turned toward Hubert, who took a step back into a prepared stance, but no attack came. Instead, the stranger began to speak in a distorted voice which cut through the silence like an arrow. "We will cross paths again," the stranger said. "I am the Flame Emperor. It is I who will reforge the world." Hubert extended a hand as if to cast a spell, but before he could gather enough magic, the Flame Emperor warped away just as the Dark Knight had done a moment earlier. The students squirmed, some of them whispering amongst themselves. Now that the immediate danger had passed, Constance pushed her way through her classmates and walked into the middle of the room, gauging the surroundings. Caspar was kneeling near the unconscious Flame and the other girl, and judging by the blood seeping through parts of his clothes, he must have been the one to take the worst hits from the knight. The others seemed shaken but not visibly harmed. She looked around for Edelgard, but the princess was nowhere to be seen. Then, had it been her imagination? Or was it the Flame Emperor who had confused her, somehow reminding her of Edelgard's aura? Swallowing, she turned to Hubert, who calmly met her gaze. "Flame Emperor," she said, tasting the name. They seemed to be working together. "Yes," he agreed. "There is clearly more to this kidnapping than simple hope of extortion. We shall have to report this to the professor." He looked past her toward the unconscious girls. "Our first order of business, however, is to get Flame and the other girl to the infirmary." "Let's carry them," Ferdinand called. "Caspar, are you?" "I'll be fine," Caspar said. "You take Flame, I'll carry this one." At their return to Juritzaw's room, they were met by the professor and Edelgard, who were both clearly relieved to see Flame alive and well. Constance excused herself before they could ask any questions, ignoring the looks she received from some of her classmates as she hurried out of the room. Flame was all right, there was nothing more she could do here now. She had far more important matters to take care of. Climbing the ladders down to Abyss took much too long. She jumped off halfway down the last one, catching herself against the wall before running on toward the Wilting Rose Inn. There were a few rogues drinking in one of the corners, and she could see Balthus by the bar, but the person she most of all needed to see was nowhere to be found. Cursing beneath her breath, she ran on down the stairs to Borough Street, elbowing her way through the crowd and to the other side. If he was here, she wouldn't find him anyway. Better hope that he was in his quarters or in their old makeshift classroom. He wasn't in the former, and as she walked into the latter, she was met only by silence. With a sigh, she stepped slowly into the middle of the room, letting her gaze rest on the blackboard as she considered her options. What should she do now? Simply wait him out? This was surely more important than whatever he was currently doing, but how was she supposed to tell him if she had no way of locating him? Discouraged, she focused her attention on something she could actually solve instead, a formula for a spell, written out on the blackboard. It wasn't one of her own formulas, although the handwriting might have fooled her. The spell, however. It was black magic, but something was off with the order of things. She studied it with a furrowed brow, wondering whether it would even work in that state. Had she been the author, she would have exchanged some of the variables with each other and used another context to wrap it all together, but she couldn't swear this formula was completely erroneous either. If she didn't know better, she would have guessed this was Yuri's work. Sometimes after he had used the blackboard for plotting his schemes, he liked to wipe it clean and write out unimportant strings of text or formulas instead, just to deflect anyone who wasn't clever or patient enough to look beyond the surface of things. But she couldn't remember having seen him use a formula for a black spell before. As far as she knew, he had little to no knowledge of the black syntax. On the other hand, that might explain the strange order of the variables. Did I make a mistake? Constance shrieked and spun around, stepping back into a prepared stance with her hands raised and ready to fire. Expecting to see someone in front of her, she was momentarily dazed when she found the room just as empty as before. Where did? Her heart almost jumped out of her chest when something moved in one of the dark corners next to the door. A finger snapped and a light orb came to life, revealing Yuri on top of the dusty old pile of crates. "You absolute scoundrel," she exclaimed, glaring at him as he snickered at her reaction. "I've been looking for you, you know." "Have you, now?" he replied with a soft smirk. "You're lucky I didn't mind being found." He turned to sit on the edge of the crate, then dropped down to the floor without a sound. On his way to her, he reached out to place a book on the nearest table. Constance took in the title almost subconsciously, Rumors of a Mockingbird. "What do you need, milady?" Her gaze snapped back to him, forcing herself to ignore the smug look on his face. "We found Flayn." She had indeed been kidnapped. It is likely that Professor Juritsah was behind it all, for we found her in a secret chamber below his room. Yuri's expression grew serious at once. "Below his room?" Constance nodded. She quickly looked around to make certain that none of his goons hid in another corner before continuing in a whisper, "It was clearly part of Abyss, Yuri." She could almost see the calculations going on behind his eyes. His gaze became distant, as though he saw right through her, but the tight clench of his jaw told her that he was far from unfocused. "Below Juritsah's room," he repeated in a murmur, seemingly more to himself than to her. "Southward, then." "There are no paths that I know of unless—" His gaze refocused again, and he swiveled in the direction of the doorway, his cape fluttering behind him as he strode toward it. "I need to investigate this," he said before pausing to look over his shoulder. "Thanks for the heads up." She nodded tightly, then watched him disappear around the corner. Yuri was many things, but stupid was not one of them. He knew as well as she did, perhaps better, what it could mean for them if it came out that someone had utilized Abyss to kidnap the sister of the Archbishop's right hand. If worse came to worst, the Church could retaliate by shutting down their entire underground haven. And even if it never came to that, the mere idea that such nefarious acts were being committed in the tunnels and chambers of Abyss turned Constance's stomach. Could she still feel safe down here? Or should she worry that next time, she could be the target? With a deep sigh, she sank down in one of the seats, letting her fingers absent-mindedly tap against the back of Yuri's book as she thought back to the battle. The night Juritsah, supposedly, had cast elder magic. Yet she was fairly certain he had only ever taught sword classes. Could it really be that he had kept his magical prowess a secret all this time? Then again, she knew that elder magic was taboo in the eyes of the Church, so it made sense that he would keep it to himself. However, that in turn made her wonder whether there were more people at the monastery, professors or students, who secretly knew how to cast elder magic. Whether Crow was one of them. Whether Crow was Juritsah. Constance's heart dropped into her gut. He couldn't be. Could he? No, he had attacked her. Surely Crow wouldn't want to hurt her. Unless he hadn't recognized her. Or had cast the spell before he did. She hid her face in her palms with a groan. If Juritsah was Crow. If he was, she couldn't possibly continue to communicate with him. She had to draw the line after researching the magic of heathens. Her conscience simply wouldn't allow her to learn from someone who kidnapped and knocked out young women. But how could she find out who he really was? What questions could she ask? If she asked directly, would he lie to her, or would he be honest? She forced herself to get up and make her way to the women's quarters, where she sat down by the desk with the compendium and a bottle of her invisible ink. She turned to a page where they had yet to make any notes and set the tip of her quill to the top of the margin, right next to a section on wind magic. "I know that Crow is a fake name, and I can accept that you need to keep your true identity from me, for your own safety. However, before I learn any more from you, I need to know, are you in any way involved with Flayn's kidnappers?" For the longest moment, she simply stared at her own scribbles, absent-mindedly noting that ink from the quill dripped down onto the page. She didn't want it to be true. She didn't want Crow to be Juritsah. But she had to know. She had to know. Hubert made himself known with 3 quick raps on the double doors, waiting until a decisive voice asked him to enter before he silently slipped inside. Perhaps no one would have batted an eyelid at the sight of the Imperial Princess vassal entering her dorm room, even at such a late hour, but he could never be too careful. In truth, he would have preferred to teleport himself directly into her room, but he did respect her privacy enough to abstain from such measures. She turned to him as the doors closed, the candle light by her sideboard coloring her face in warmth and accentuating her fine features. He bowed deeply, his gaze reverently lowering to the ground. "Your Highness." "Hubert," she said, skipping over the pleasantries entirely. "You were hurt today." He raised his gaze to meet her worried frown. To think that such an insignificant thought would be at the forefront of her mind at a time like this. "It's of no consequence," he assured her. "We have a skilled healer." Her expression softened somewhat. "And yet—" "Your Highness, if I may," he said. "While it is my responsibility to ascertain that you come to no harm, you have no such responsibility toward me." "I know, Hubert, I just—" She turned abruptly, supporting her palms against the sideboard as she lowered her head. He waited for her to continue, but when she didn't, he elected to ease her mind of what he assumed must be haunting it. "Please do not blame yourself for what happened in the catacombs, Lady Edelgard. You had no way of knowing the full extent of their plans." He, on the other hand, he had successfully implanted Empire soldiers and spies throughout the ranks of the Church of Syros, meaning that he had eyes and ears at practically every corner. With all that intelligence at his beck and call, he should have been able to anticipate Flayn's kidnapping, and yet somewhere along the line, his precautions had failed. Lady Edelgard sighed deeply. "I wonder every single day whether I made the right choice in allying with those people." The anxiety was clear in her voice. It was his duty to relieve her of it as best he could. "It is a necessary evil," he said, repeating the words he so often told her. "We need their power for now. However, there is no need for you to bother with the gritty details. You can leave those to me. Whatever you need me to do, I will do it, even if you are not yet aware of your need." Lady Edelgard straightened and turned to face him again. "Are you implying that you keep secrets from me, Hubert?" He allowed himself a small smirk as he bowed again. "Respectfully, Your Highness, you need not trouble yourself with the mundane details of my actions. All that matters is results, and you can always trust me to act in your best interests." She tilted her head to the side and narrowed her eyes, as she always did when she attempted to figure him out. He simply waited it out, confident that she would be as unsuccessful this time as every other. If there was anything he'd learned from all the years by her side, it was how to successfully keep her in the dark. Never concerning anything that might harm her, of course, but just the little bits and pieces that weren't vital for her to learn. She sincerely didn't need to know about all the things he did to serve her interests, it would only bring her more suffering. Fortunately, she seemed to grasp the necessity of this as well. Eventually, her shoulders relaxed, and she gave him a small nod. "I suppose I will have to accept that answer. For now." She glanced toward her desk, following her gaze. He could see that her drawing materials were out. "You can leave. I have other business to attend to." He bowed. "As you wish, Lady Edelgard." After closing the door behind him, Hubert paused for a moment to consider his next move. It was clear that his security measures were not enough. Perhaps he had underestimated his opponent, he rarely did, but these were no ordinary people he was dealing with. He would have to adjust his beliefs and view of the world according to what he had learned from the events in the past few days. Their so-called allies had reasons for everything, so surely the kidnapping was no mere chance occurrence. A quick and subtle examination when no one was looking had revealed a familiar puncture wound in Flayn's right arm, a wound that, without his prior knowledge of the slithering foes, might have been easily overlooked. He could only guess that her blood was somehow important in order for them to achieve results with their recent experiments. It was certainly cause for more investigation into Flayn's background. Thus, he had already given Linhard the assignment of figuring out the secret of her blood. While the other mage could be hopelessly difficult to motivate, Hubert had found that he was extraordinarily driven when it came to his interests. And his spies in the monastery had informed him that Linhard had an interest of his own in Flayn, more specifically, her crest. It hadn't been difficult to convince him to dive deeper into the subject of her blood. He had asked why, at which Hubert had told him a near truth, that the answer could allow them to get ahead of their mysterious enemies, potentially leading to a quick and decisive victory. Apparently that hadn't been enough for Linhard. If I do this, it's going to take valuable time from other activities, such as doing other research, sleeping, eating, battling. Hubert had already seen where he was going with it. You are utterly hopeless, he'd said while shaking his head in disappointment. You want me to give my all in this research, right? But I don't think I have the time for it right now. I can get you out of one practice battle every month, he'd proposed. The professor wouldn't like it and neither would Lady Edelgard, but Hubert was confident that he could come up with a convincing excuse. That's fair, I suppose, but one battle is just a few hours. I don't know how much I can do with so little time. Truly a charmer in disguise, that one. One practice battle each month and one seminar each week, Hubert had said, and that is my final offer. I guess I can work with that. At least Linhard had then proceeded to give him what knowledge he already possessed about Flayn, and while it didn't answer all the questions, it had proven to be illuminating enough. I learned from Hanuman's records that she carries the major crest of Cethline, which is beyond rare even among nobles. I possess the same crest, but only the minor one. I think she may have some kind of connection to Saint Cethline. Here, Linhard had paused for a few seconds. Maybe looking into Seath would shed light on the matter. Hanuman might have records on him as well. Good. Then get on that. Yeah. A connection to Saint Cethline was promising, if not enough to explain on its own why Flayn's blood would be of special interest to their foes. But he would have to wait for Linhard to dig into it more deeply. There was no use in pondering on it further at the moment. There was, however, something else he could do. Something where, at least, he still had the upper hand. Assuming that Constance's pattern stayed the same, she would have returned the book by now. The library closed in half an hour, leaving him plenty of time to go and fetch it. After today's events, it was probably safe to assume that she had questions. Questions that might be uncomfortable to answer, but that needed answers nonetheless. He made his way to the library, carefully ensuring that no one followed him or watched as he slid the compendium out of its nook. After checking the book out, he returned to his room and sat by his desk, easily channeling the elder magic required to reveal the ink in the margins before flipping through the pages to search for new notes. As he reached the end without having found any, he began to doubt. Would she really have returned it to the library without a single new note? No, he must have missed something. He browsed through the chapter on elder magic more carefully, but still there were no new notes. Only after he had browsed through the rest of the book as carefully as the last chapter did he finally find it. In chapter 12 on wind magic, beginning in a completely blank margin with no connection to the page's contents whatsoever, was a short new note for him. I know that Crow is a fake name, and I can accept that you need to keep your true identity from me, for your own safety. However, before I learn any more from you, I need to know, are you in any way involved with Flayn's kidnappers? Hubert considered the note for another moment, feeling a slow smile tug at one corner of his mouth. Perhaps he should have expected this. Constance had a tendency to get straight to the point. His gaze moved down along the page, taking in the blotches of ink that had no doubt dripped down from her quill as she considered her own note. Had she felt hesitation? Regret? Fear? He believed he could discern worry in her words, but that was to be expected. She may not have shown much during the battle, but he had seen the way she had frozen at the sight of Juritzaw's elder spell. She had not written it explicitly, but it was clear as day that what she really wondered was whether Crow was Juritzaw. That fact was somehow amusing to him, that she had been hooked on the idea that Juritzaw was her secret tutor after seeing a single elder spell, yet she had never questioned how it could be that Hubert knew a warp spell even though he never cast any other faith magic. Perhaps she simply wasn't as attentive as he'd believed her to be. Now for what he should answer her. He could always outright lie, but he would prefer not to. There were ways that he could sidestep the truth instead, ways that would be beneficial further down the road. And he needed to think ahead. Besides, this was as good an opportunity as any to drip-feed more details to her. Show some good faith and give her more reason to trust him. Seeing how certain events were progressing, perhaps he didn't have as much time to gain her trust as he had planned. Perhaps the recent occurrences were exactly what he needed to speed things up. Uncorking his ink bottle, he dipped the quill and carefully inked out a response below her note. Ah yes, I heard about that. A professor turned out to be a masked kidnapper wielding forbidden magic. Even if I were that callous, do you truly believe I would be so indiscreet about it? The short answer is that I did not know of his plans, nor was I a part of them. But you deserve more than the short answer. As a token of good faith, I shall tell you a well-kept secret of elder mages. Most wielders of elder magic are connected in one way or another. We are so few, so rare, and there are so few resources on the arts, that it is quite simply impossible to learn elder magic without intervention by an experienced elder mage. If you continue down this path, you will soon come to learn that there is only so far you can advance on your own. Even my guidance won't be sufficient if you truly wish to master the arts. The power is channeled through algebraic formulas, but without an elder ritual, you can never unlock the most powerful spells. The truth, then, is that while I have little interest in what other elder mages do with their powers, it would be false to say that I am in no way involved with them. You see, I have gone through the elder ritual. Thus, we are connected. You are as cryptic as ever. No, in the event that you had been the Death Knight, I do believe that you would have gone about the abduction quite differently, would you not? Now tell me, what does such a ritual entail? It is a dangerous ritual, and until you have reached the limits of what you can achieve with complex arithmetics, I advise you not to delve into it further. If the day comes when you seek even more power, then I will tell you what the ritual entails. Until then, you shall have to pace yourself. Pace myself? It appears you still have much to learn about me. Yes. That is becoming more and more clear. Check the description for the links to the author.